It all started a few years ago when I was at a friend's house. For legal reasons, I'll call him Melvin. We had both dabbed with different drugs for a few years, and we thought that we knew our limits as far as certain substances were concerned. We had also had some interest in Datura because a friend of ours had recently eaten some seeds and tripped off of them. He didn't really give us details, but had said that they were extremely powerful. With that in mind, we went off to harvest some seed pods and eat the seeds. The plants were growing in the front yard of somebody's house. They were about 4 feet tall and had some fruits that were covered in sharp spikes. Melvin said that we'd better pick them fast so that the people whose yard we were on wouldn't bitch. We each picked about 5 seed pods and went to his house, where we opened them up, took the seeds out, and proceeded to eat some. I remember the seeds tasted extremely bitter, almost too bitter to keep down, but we managed. After we took all the seeds, about 150, we both kind of sat around for 30 minutes anticipating the trip. At the end of those 30 minutes, I began to feel very hot and everything had a hazy quality to it. I also noticed that my mouth felt drier than it ever had before. Think of running a marathon in the Sahara Desert with no water while smoking an enormous blunt, and you will realize just how unpleasant Datura cunt mouth really is. Melvin got up to get some water for us, and then I looked at my hands for some reason. There appeared to be smoke or steam coming off of them, and I started to notice that the walls were melting. Not breathing or shifting around like on shrooms or acid, but actually melting like butter on a frying pan. At this point, I became very frightened with the idea that maybe the entire world will melt into a cosmic puddle, with me and everyone I know in it melting as well. Melvin finally came back with the water and told me to go to the next room and look at your eyes. They're fucking huge. I remembered that my pupils were so dilated that my whole eye appeared black, and I thought that I must be some alien and then walked back to Melvin with the newfound realization that I was an alien. I don't remember too much after that, but apparently we both walked around town in a completely dazed and psychotic state all day, talking to imaginary people and believing we had the ability to teleport from place to place. Some of our friends had run into us and, realizing how fucked up we were, became our babysitters for the day and told us parts of the trip that we couldn't remember. After several hours of this, Melvin wandered off to the local park and some of my friends/babysitters began going home. One of them asked how I was feeling, and my response was something like, "Only if the water is 1 billion years old." At some point, somebody called my mom and told her to come pick me up because I was really fucked up. She came and picked me up and then drove me to the hospital after seeing exactly how fucked up I was. It turns out that she thought I had taken some kind of terminal, Syd Barrett-style acid trip or had suddenly gone completely insane. I was wearing no shirt or shoes, my brand new glasses were missing, and I was ranting and raving about things that weren't there. I ended up in the emergency room where I had to be restrained by police, orderlies, etc. because I kept trying to escape. The doctor stuck all kinds of needles in my arms and hands and I kept trying to take them out. I remember looking at my left hand and then looking at my mom saying, "Look, the Japanese blood islands." After that, I don't remember too much about the hospital, except the day after when I was tripping extremely hard and came to the realization that I was being held against my will and being sexually tortured with a catheter and started shrieking uncontrollably for what felt like forever. Apparently Datura makes you unable to urinate, so the doctors put a catheter in my penis. You have no idea what pain or fear is until you try to pull a catheter out while tripping on Datura. I want to make that clear. I was discharged about 4 days later, but I had to go to rehab after that because I was still a minor and had OD'd. For the next year or so, I struggled to come to terms with what happened to my mind that day, and became very strange and reclusive without the desire to go to school or get a job or do anything, really. I finally got a job not too long ago, and it has helped out my mental state a bit. In closing, I urge anyone who wants to try Datura not to try it. How not to do Datura. What you are about to read is a shining example that Datura is indeed not a drug to be taken lightly, or in my opinion, used, period. I had been dating a wonderful woman with an amazing family for just over a month. I was completely down on my luck when we met, and to this day, I still don't know why she took a chance on me. I noticed a datura plant growing in her grandma's front yard. Being curious, I picked a seed pod and held onto it for a few days. I had read about this substance for years and wanted to try it, but have never found it growing wild and refused to purchase anything I intend to ingest from the internet. I have an extensive drug history. I do not feel the need to qualify myself farther. The first time I tried eating the seeds, I had 5 as a test run. Nothing happened. The next time, 15. Again, nothing. I was beginning to wonder. But of course, third time's a charm, or in my case, a curse. I consumed 40 seeds one morning approximately 11 a.m. I was in good spirits and had no major worries pending that needed immediate attention that day. I did not have a sitter, never have, never really needed one. Began doing things to pass the time, watched some TV, played Xbox, and checked Facebook. An hour or so in, I began to feel different, mildly fuzzy, I guess, but in previous experiences this has never happened, so I thought it best to go get in bed and cover up and see what happened. That is my last real memory. I am told I went completely insane. I ingested copious amounts of her grandma's medication, including but not limited to gabapentin, lorazepam, tramadol, and her grandson's Ritalin. Not some of it, all of it, roughly 200 milligrams. I tried vacuuming mattresses and I went to the bathroom, pissed all over the floors, all in front of this poor woman and her grandchildren. My girlfriend and her mother were called along with an ambulance and the police. Thank God that they handled the police because I'm only on parole. I went to the hospital via ambulance and was admitted to the psych ward. I finally came to senses around 48 hours later. I still have somehow salvaged the relationship with the girlfriend, but I am mortified by my actions. I had been struggling on and off with sobriety, but this drug may have finally given me the kick in the ass I needed to stop. I don't know if anyone will read and take note of anything I have said, but I am going on record as saying this is the most overwhelming, powerful drug I have ever done. And I have completed treatment for IV heroin use, just for example's sake. I honestly don't know how I remember any of this experience other than what people told me of what happened. It started one beautiful morning. I had been planning for this day all summer. I had slowly accumulated 1 gram of opium, 2.5 grams of mushrooms, and a decent bag of good pot. I knew this day would dwarf all other experiences times 1,000,000. I called my friend P to come over and be my sitter. I knew no matter how used to any individual drug I was, this would make me need a sitter. Before P came over, I took my blender and put about 300 Morning Glory seeds, 20 Datura seeds, 2 dried peyote, my 2.5 grams of mushrooms, and added ice-cold vodka for good measure. I blended it on puree for a few minutes and it turned a dark brown color. Bam! The cover blew off. Very disappointed, I cleaned up the beautifully drugged up mess and chilled what remained. When P finally came over, we had decided to start my day off with a few bowls of reefer. Feeling pretty stoned, I decided to let P finish the bowl, and I filled the bowl with an opium weed mix. Feeling rather pleasant, I decided that it was time to start my trip. Knowing that this concoction was going to taste worse than shit, I added almost a whole box of sugar to it. I slowly sipped from the blender for about 30 minutes. The second I had my first sip, I started to feel what I thought was the alky. After I finished the mix, I knew it hit me very fast, and before I was totally destroyed, I decided to smoke a leaf or two of some dried salvia. After my first hit, I blacked out. P said that I kept shaking and muttering some really weird song. When I came up, I remember seeing infinitely tall vines growing all around me with little bug-like things flying over my head. I had never tripped so hard ever in my life. My brain felt like it was going to fall out of my skull. Seconds later, I remembered I had a stomach full of miscellaneous drugs and vomited violently 2 or 3 times. Words in this language of ours can't fully explain how I felt at this point. It was like I was in a whole other realm of thought and perception. I had forgotten P was still with me. I couldn't see anything through these ever-growing vines, but I was somewhat sure I was still on my back porch. My thought patterns were ever-growing, and every thought had a million other tangents attached to them, and so on. I blacked out for a while longer, and the next thing I remember is being in the center of a circle containing all realms of existence, and everything and everyone that encompasses them. But I wasn't a living being in this realm. I was a mesh-like thing connected to all that could possibly be imagined by anyone or anything. Unfortunately, that's all I remember. When I finally started to come down, I thought I was in some sort of new reality that only I was in. Then, I saw P, and he started to calm me down. He said I had been staring into space all night, shaking from time to time. By the time I totally sobered up, it was the next morning. For the next few days, I wasn't sure about anything or anyone I ever knew. But I slowly realized that I just took a ton of drugs and tripped really hard. I still wonder sometimes if I always was in this existence, but the fact that I'm here now tells me to cope with where I am. I do not recommend this to anyone who isn't ready for a total life overhaul. To best describe this trip, I'm going to use half of what I remember and half of what my friends told me what happened. I recall the warm March day very well. It was during my spring break senior year in high school. We had set out to trade the Datura leaves with the rainbow people in Buck Lake. Usually around this time of year, I am able to bring the pots, pans, perishable food, milk, eggs, etc., and they would trade me with either some of the finest marijuana or LSD. Seeing as how there was an extreme shortage of LSD, we set out with the goal of trading the Datura and some food for LSD. We arrive and nobody has anything. So we have all of this Datura and camping supplies, and we are in the middle of the forest, so naturally, we camp. We drink a few beers and fired up a blunt. Then my friend tells me that we should take the Datura and some Dramamine and trip all night. I thought, what the heck? So instead of picking the white flowers, he picked the green leaves. He said it would work, and I believed him. So, I took about 10 Dramamine and 3 green leaves about the size of my hand. What happens next is probably the hardest thing ever to recall. I have used LSD, mushrooms, and other drugs, but nothing, I mean nothing, could compare to the sheer power of the trip I was about to experience. The trip began with no onset. As a matter of fact, I don't recall the feeling of ever tripping. There was no visuals such as color changes or moving objects as with LSD or shrooms. This was purely hallucinations. Nothing was real, nothing was fake. There was no distinguishing reality from the fantasy world. I completely forgot that I'd even taken a drug. This part of the story is told through the eyes of my friends. The first experience, we all set out our separate ways, 3 of us. When they found me, they said I was in a lake with weeds matted down around me in a perfect circle and was shouting at them that I was in a Target playing PlayStation. Then I told them that I was in B's pool. B does not have a pool. I sure as hell thought he did that night. I will be damned if I was not swimming in it. Neither me or my friends recall much until I said that. I was ready to go back to Pat's, 20 to 30 miles away from the woods. They said that I demanded to let me drive and we should go back. They did not think so, so I left them. This next part of the story is my own recollection. I do not remember leaving them or driving anywhere. I start my memory recall with me standing on the edge of the woods off of a country road where a local spring was. I remember seeing my car on a dirt embankment and Lake County Sheriff's SUV behind my car. I remember having no feeling of being afraid or scared of getting arrested. I still do not remember taking any drug and do not realize that I am tripping balls. The officer approached me and asked for my ID. In the report, it stated that I reached down to the ground and handed him a pile of dirt. The reason I know this is because the lady at the dispatcher's office was the mother of one of the friends that I was tripping with. The initial belief was that I was a mentally retarded kid who stole his parents' car. I remember him searching my car, and then for some reason he says, "Don't worry, you are not in trouble. You are not being arrested. I'm just Baker acting you." I had no idea what he meant, but I was too calm and relaxed to do anything. So, I was placed in cuffs and put in the back of the cop's SUV. During the ride there, somehow another officer appeared in the front seat and they began to smoke pot. If I was sober, I would have been like, "What the hell?" But at the time, it did not seem to bother me. Luckily, I did not say anything because the second officer and the pot did not exist. We finally arrived to the hospital to take blood and find out what the hell I was on. The officer asked me to step out the vehicle. I looked down and realized that I was shackled to the vehicle. Not really. Suddenly, the image of shackles disappears right before my eyes. I realize now that I am on something and I am beginning to come down. I was escorted into the hospital and placed on a bed, and they began to draw blood. Now, images of people and things began to appear and disappear, while the images that were there seemed so realistic, so real that I could touch, smell, and hear them. It seemed like they were really there. There was a complete interaction with the hallucinations. The doctors found nothing in their standard drug tests. I was now becoming sober enough to remember bits and pieces, and I recall taking the drugs. I told the doctors what I had taken. They said the only thing for me to do is to go into detox until the drug completely wears off. I remember sitting in the chair at the detox and random people would sit in the chair beside me. All of them would disappear within a minute. The only person that was actually beside me was my mother, and she kept asking me who I was talking to. So, my mother got me signed in, and they said that I would have to be in there at least 24 hours, and the doctor would evaluate me and tell me whether or not I was okay to go. The next day, I woke up completely sober and feeling refreshed. I had tripped for a solid 24 hours. The doctor evaluated me and said that I was good to go. Through all of the different drugs I have done, I usually do them more than once. This drug I did once and will never touch again. So I've been waiting for a chance to try Datura for a while now. I read a lot about it and I thought I was ready for what's to come. I invited an old female friend over to spot me since she tried almost every drug out there, Datura not included. And after she got here, I told her not to let me smoke. Pour water down my throat if I seem not to manage to do it myself. Hell, I even had handcuffs ready for if I go berserk and try to attack her. I told her to check my pulse and temperature every once in a while and to call the hospital immediately if anything seems wrong. I then went and crushed about 0.25 teaspoons and mixed it with about 330 milliliters of water. I boiled it for a few minutes, let it chill, and drank it in small sips. I did not drink the seed leftovers though. So we sat and talked for about 20 minutes before it hit me. I thought that since I used such a small dosage, I'll be only mildly experimenting with it rather than fucking myself up, but was I wrong? At the beginning, I felt very nauseous, my guts hurt, and my mouth went dry. Since it was bearable, I decided to drink some Coke and try to let it pass. By now, I was hurting all over. My head started pounding as if I was in the sun too long and hadn't drank for a couple hours. The pain was overwhelming, but apparently my pulse was still within normal, because although my friend seemed rather worried, she did not call the hospital. I felt as if claws were closing on my stomach, but my head was somewhere else. Kind of a fainting feel. I'm out. I wake up in my bed a couple of days later, Saturday. My friend proved her friendship and stayed right next to me for the entire period of time. She said that for the first night, she cuffed me to my bed because she didn't want me to go to sleep when I'm like that. But then she said I was moaning, so she untied me. I wasn't violent, I wasn't moving. She said that I wasn't there at all. I was looking forward with eyes halfway open and entirely dilated. I wasn't mumbling most of the time, and I can't recall a thing. I kind of shriek sometimes. I did pee on myself, but I was ready for that and covered my bed with plastic bags under the sheets. I was sweating like hell, but it was fairly hot. The only thing I remember was an occasional gag over a water bottle that was shoved in my face. I did not hallucinate that, and probably did not hallucinate at all. If I did, I cannot remember a thing of it. After I woke up, I still had a fever, but my pulse was perfectly normal. I did not bleed and did not die, but it did not feel like a trip. You can get the same response from drinking a nice glass of bleach. Don't. The most dominant pain was the stomach clawing. After that was the dryness, which was taking care of my good friend whose friendship I came to value even more. I couldn't see almost at all, but this calmed down rather quickly for me. I want to stress that this is not the commonly used Datura, but the kind that grows around these areas. This is just strictly poison. When I was 18, I was in a strange place in the world. I was homeless, penniless, and with no real ambition to pull myself out of the gutter. Although I was without the basic necessities of food and shelter, I had a steady supply of drugs that were dispensed, I suppose, out of sympathy by many of my friends. I went to sleep hungry and cold every night, but never sober. One evening, before I left a party to hit the streets to find a broom closet or a stairwell to lay my head, a guy I barely knew gave me a large freezer bag full of brown, spiky pods. What are these? Jimson weed. The seeds will make you trip. Maybe you can sell them. I don't want them. He told me to split the pod open and eat half of the seeds if I really wanted to trip hard. To me, that meant eat the whole pod, since I always found recommended dosages to be unsatisfying. I chose not to dose that night since I already was tired and afraid that I might fall asleep before the trip kicked in. I slept in a building gutted by a fire a few years before, and the freezing November air woke me up just before dawn. I got up and walked into town to raise my body temperature and avoid hypothermia. This was my daily morning ritual. Obviously, 5 a.m. in a small city offers very little in terms of recreation, so I decided it was the right time to open the door of perception and begin my day with a psychedelic breakfast. I chose the largest pod in the bag, which was also the darkest in color. I was told afterward the most potent seeds are the deepest brown. The seeds were terribly bitter and many of the shells got stuck in my teeth. I managed to finish the entire pod with little help from a public water fountain. I watched a beautiful sunrise from the roof of an apartment building, constantly waiting for the effects of the Jimson weed to take effect. I can't say how long I sat until the seeds started working, but the first noticeable signs came in the form of extreme thirst and general physical discomfort. Finding the feelings of dehydration was too strong to ignore. I went to a nearby McDonald's for free ice water. It must have been after 9 because the only people in the restaurant were old guys getting free refills on senior citizen discounted coffee. I sat in a booth in the back corner sipping water through a cracked straw, watching the thirsty elderly redneck parade. It didn't take long for me to realize I was entering into a very hallucinogenic trip. The fact that I hadn't eaten a real meal in a week and I was sleep deprived probably added to the drug's intensity, but I can't imagine a big dinner and full 8 hours would have made too much of a difference. Unlike the onset of an E or acid trip, my mental state was very comfortable, but my physical condition felt quite unhealthy. The heavy sense of inebriation was quickly followed by powerful, disorienting visuals. Though they were not disturbing, they seemed as clear as sunlight. Black cats milled about the floor in front of me, so numerous I couldn't even see the tile. They appeared wet and angry. There was a deep crimson blood dripping from the ceiling. Everything was technicolor. The sense of detachment was strong, but it didn't feel strange. Each hallucination flowed into the next. I was holding a very old Bible in my lap. I couldn't figure out how to open it. Soon, it started to leak blood. The more I struggled, the more it bled. As soon as I realized my efforts were futile, the book materialized into the air around me. It didn't seem strange to me. When I analyzed the room again, It was a bustling, futuristic metropolis. It appeared very large and very alien, with shining chrome and flashing lights everywhere. I began to feel discomfort and a strong urge to urinate simultaneously. I staggered into the bathroom and vomited in the closest urinal, right in front of an Amish man. Now, I live in South Central Pennsylvania, so it's very possible that he was really there, but considering my state and other people's accounts of Datura-induced visuals, I suspect he was just a hallucination. I do not know that I relieved myself somewhere in the bathroom and left through the side exit adjacent to the lavatory door. The street outside was a scene of World War II ravaged Europe. I don't know which country, but everyone on the street was garbed in a Nazi military uniform. I felt very threatened. I ran into the alley behind the parking lot and hid behind a pine tree. The anxiety soon ebbed, but the thirst and need to urinate returned. I knew I needed a comfort zone, a place I could relax in. A friend lived nearby. I walked to his apartment complex and stood in front of the stairwell. The same crimson blood from the McDonald's was cascading down the steps. It began to rise over my shoes, up my legs. A heavy sense of vertigo came over me. There's a memory gap between the stairs and my friend's apartment, but I ended up on his couch watching dolphins dive through the wall in a seamless loop. During my time there, I experienced the typical non-existent cigarette search and then the disappearing person puzzle. I visited the bathroom many times but eliminated very little. The sense of dehydration was unbearable. There was no comfort. I did not recognize the people in the room. I asked the person closest to me where Bill was. "Bill's not here," was the return. I closed my eyes to escape the growing sense of panic, but when my eyelids shut, all I saw was a new room with new people. Where was I? I tried to reopen my eyes, but it only revealed another room with yet more strangers. This went on and on. I didn't know if my eyes were open or shut. I didn't know where I was, what time it was, or what was even happening. My panic turned into a sensory collapse. Everything bled together and I felt a deep spiraling sensation engulf me. I lost all visual capabilities, but I still had a very real sense of touch. I was trapped in a small metallic box. It made perfect sense to me. I was dead. This was hell. There were no demons, no hellfire or brimstone, just a deep, complete feeling of darkness and hopelessness. This was the never-ending void. Not at all how I imagined it, but worse than I thought it could have been. I've had feelings of infinite emotion on acid trips and sensation of universal truth in K-holes, but this was the most profound reality I had ever experienced. My whole existence was put into perspective, and I was being punished for wasting the gift of life. I blacked out at some point in the box and woke up in my friend's apartment the next day. He said I was out for about 8 hours. The physical effects wore off about a day later, but the psychological impression has yet to fade. Datura is boundless. Datura is powerful beyond words. Datura is poison. He collected about 3 to 4 ounces of seeds one weekend. He was driving back with his friend and took 2 teaspoonfuls of seeds. After about a half an hour, he still wasn't feeling the effects, so he reached in the bag and grabbed a handful of seeds and started munching. His friend was, flabbergasted. This guy must have had any clue of what it would do to him. Well, 10 minutes later, he's feeling the effects a bit, just a bit of a buzz, and drops his friend, stoned out of his mind, at his house and goes to park the car. Friend forgets about him for about an hour, go figure, and this is what happened. He drove off and doesn't know where he was heading, but he ended up running his mom's brand new Audi into a tree at some apartment complex. He was still functional enough to realize that he knew someone who lived in the area and went to her house. When she opened the door, he was babbling about nothing at all and was just running off at the mouth. The girl was a friend and loaded him into her car and took him to his house and dropped him off in the street. He walked inside his house, maybe 1.75 hours after eating, and goes into his room, gets his boombox, and goes to the bathroom to take a shower. Strips down naked, gets in the shower, no water, gets out, takes radio downstairs, still naked, and starts cleaning, moving furniture, and dusting, etc. While his mom is sitting in the room trying to watch TV, she asks him what the hell he thinks he's doing. He replies, "God damn it, Mom, leave me alone. Can't you see I'm trying to take a shower? Damn!" Then he starts babbling again. Well, his mom called for the paramedics. He was lucky, pumped him full of some other drug, Thorazine maybe, fuzzy here, and pumped his stomach. Doctor said he was very lucky, maybe within an hour of death. Just thought I'd post this story, kinda funny, but very serious undertones. That shit messes with you. Set and setting aside, be prepared for a wild time. This is a report not about my own experiences, but rather the story of a friend who recently had a frightening ordeal with the seed pods of a Datura plant. Early this summer, this friend who we'll call Pat went on an extended, multiple-week vacation with his family to Florida. Pat is an upperclassman in high school and has a reputation of doing very stupid things with hallucinogens. Knowing he would be unable to drink or smoke pot during his vacation, Pat brought with him a full bag of Datura pods. One night, despite warnings his friends and even I had given him, he ate all the seeds from the 3 seed pods. An hour went by, and Pat didn't feel anything, so he ate another pod. From what Pat told me, the first hour or so of actual tripping was enjoyable and controllable. He spoke to friends who were actually still back in his hometown, and then they would leave the room and never come back. It's amazing how similar all of the accounts of Datura trips are in this respect. By this time, it was fairly late at night, and Pat's entire family was asleep. They were soon awakened, however, as Pat began screaming at the top of his lungs for his 2 younger brothers to shut up. Both of them were asleep in their beds, and there stood Pat, screaming at them, "Shut the fuck up and be quiet!" When his dad walked in, Pat freaked and darted into the bathroom. He began scrubbing the bathtub furiously, apparently trying to look sober. Pat's dad, aware that his son was obviously hallucinating, but unable to get him to admit what he took, drove Pat to the hospital. The doctors at the hospital didn't know what was up, and the drug tests were all negative. One of them came to the conclusion that a prescription medication Pat was taking had triggered the early onset of schizophrenia. The entire time Pat was examined, he was speaking to people who weren't there, and sometimes to himself out loud. Apparently this medication had been known to do that in patients with the right conditions for future mental illness. Pat spent the next 3 days in a psychiatric unit, although from his account he only realized where he was there on the 3rd day. For the duration of his time there, Pat had to be accompanied by a suicide guard as a precaution. On the 3rd day, as he was coming down, he got pissed off at another patient who was talking in Ebonics, so he screamed at him, "You aren't black!" As a result, Pat had to sit in the timeout room, a tiny room with padded walls, floors, and ceiling, for 20 minutes. Pat was very stupid with the Datura that he took, and it ended up ruining his vacation, costing his family thousands in medical bills, and landing him in rehab at the demand of his family. When he regained reality and told doctors the name of the plant that he took, surprise, surprise, they had never heard of it before. While it is a funny story in retrospect, I feel indirectly at fault. I was the one who told this kid where he could find the plants and what they did, on the week before his vacation. So, I have this friend, who will remain nameless, who informed my boyfriend and I about these seed pods growing on someone's front lawn near my high school. The first thing that came to my mind was, woo, free hallucinogenics. He suggested that we smoke the plant or brew some tea with it, we decided it would be much easier to just eat a few of the seeds and see what happened. Day 1, October 27th, 2005. My boyfriend and I had experimented with the seeds the night before, but we felt no effects. He didn't want to bother with any further experimentation, but I, on the other hand, am a very curious person. I decided that maybe if I took a few capfuls of the stuff, I would have a better trip. Man, was I ever wrong. 4:30 p.m. I take a capful of the Datura seeds at my boyfriend's house, even though he kept telling me not to. We were just on our way to my apartment and I decided to take a capful on the way to the bus stop. 5:15 p.m. I'm laying on my bed watching TV with my boyfriend drinking Jones's soda when my head starts to feel funny. My body is all tingly and my head feels inflated. I'm also very, very thirsty from what I can remember. 5:20 p.m. I am delirious and the hallucinations have started to kick in. I thought I was back in my boyfriend's basement and I turned to him grabbing my guitar and said, "Okay, Chris, I gotta go home now." And to my surprise, he says, "But Mel, you are home." And I'm like, "Chris, that's not funny. I gotta get to class." I was now hallucinating that I was in front of my school and I was grabbing my guitar to go to class. 5:45 p.m. My boyfriend informs my mom that I have ingested Datura because he's so concerned about my hallucinations and my lack of ability to speak or even form words. We go outside while my mom calls the poison control center, and according to my boyfriend, I couldn't even hold my cigarette or stand up properly. My purse would continuously slip off my arm and my cigarette would keep falling out of my hand because my mind was no longer with me. 6 p.m. Poison control has reserved a space in the emergency room for me because I had ingested a poisonous substance which the hospital has heard little about. My mom makes me put my shoes back on, which wasn't easy. I kept putting 2 different shoes on because I was having trouble deciding which one was prettier than the other. 6:20 p.m. We are on our way to the hospital that is about 5 minutes from my apartment, and I'm nodding out in the front seat. When my mom parks the car, I'm passed out and worrying both her and my boyfriend as they frantically try to wake me up. We get into emergency and Chris sits me down in a wheelchair, where I began to pick the fluff off the sweater that the black lady sitting next to me was wearing. I was acting like a retard. I can't remember anything except for what my mom or boyfriend told me after this. Later that night, I'm in a room in emergency and I'm being restrained because I won't stay still so the staff can sedate me. My heart rate was soaring over the normal number. It was like my heart was running a marathon for 24 hours. After being sedated, my body is pumped with charcoal while my boyfriend stands next to me, but far enough away, like the doctor said, in case I threw up. Day 2, October 28th, 2005. I'm still sedated and remember nothing from the night before. I have been moved to the pediatric ward where I have my own room with a border of hockey players, a TV, and my favorite teddy bear. I leave my comatose state around dinner time, but I'm still experiencing strong hallucinations. 7 p.m. Daddy Daycare is on the TV, but I don't remember watching it. My boyfriend and mom are still with me and have been for the entire day. Neither of them knew whether I would come out of this without permanent damage to myself. My boyfriend had mixed my peas into my mashed potatoes for me, like I always do, and promised that he would stay with me no matter what happened. 7:10 p.m. I finished eating and I'm now capable of holding conversations with my mom and boyfriend. I supposedly performed an exorcism on my mom because I thought she was possessed. Her face kept morphing and bugs were crawling out of her eye sockets. There were also bugs crawling all over the floor of the hospital room as well. My boyfriend's logo on his shirt turned into a bunch of feathers. I saw a little puppy running around the room, and I kept seeing pixies and stars everywhere. Stars kept covering my hands, and I had to keep brushing them off. 8 p.m. My boyfriend's mom and his sister came to visit me, along with my grandfather. I was slowly returning to normal, but not quite. Only an hour or two before, I had come to the conclusion that while I was sedated, I was surgically given a penis. It was really a catheter, but I didn't know that. Zena, my boyfriend's mom, asked me about the hockey players on the ceiling, and I informed her that one of them was beating the crap out of the other, and there was a boat sailing by her. 8:20 p.m. Two security guards came into my room as I wheeled myself around on the wheelchair, gaining the nickname Wheels from my boyfriend and grandfather. The security guards told us that I was being moved to a better room because a baby was being moved into the room I was in. I wanted Chris to push my wheelchair, but they wouldn't let him. They wheeled me to the basement of the hospital, right towards a psychiatric ward. I was totally confused. I didn't know why they were taking me there. I was so scared. 8:30 p.m. The woman working the night shift informs us that I'm staying here for a few days under observation, just to make sure that my hallucinations do stop and that I make it out okay. By then, I was only having mild hallucinations and knew exactly what was going on. They wouldn't let my mom or boyfriend stay overnight, and I started bawling because I was so afraid. They forced a sleeping pill on me, and since they had a smoking room down there, my mom had to get a doctor's note saying that even though I was under 18, I was allowed to smoke in there. 9 p.m. My mom comes back with a suitcase of pajamas, toiletries, makeup, etc., and tucks me into bed. A security guard sits on a chair in my room keeping an eye on me because I was the youngest, most sane person in the psychiatric ward. The chair was doing some shit out of Jumanji, and vines were coming out of it and stuff. Every time I blinked, it would go away and start all over again. Day 3, October 29th, 2005. I finally fell asleep around 10 o'clock that night and woke up well rested in the morning. I was still seeing barely visible insects crawling on the floor, but within an hour, all the hallucinations had finally stopped. I got up and took a shower and did my makeup to make myself feel better. I spent the morning watching TV until my family came to visit at visiting hours. Day 4, October 30th, 2005. After watching TV for a good 4 hours, I have one last visit with the psychiatrist who says I can leave as soon as my family arrived. I literally jumped for joy. I was finally getting out of that hellhole. I can finally go home. 2 p.m. My mom and boyfriend get to the hospital and I was already packed and ready to go. I flipped off the staff who had been hassling me for the entire duration of my admittance and made my way out. I got more and more excited the closer we got to the doors. I was like a kid making my way into a candy store. It was a beautiful day and it felt great to be alive. The three of us got back to my apartment and my mom and boyfriend told me everything that I've just told you guys, because I can't remember anything after putting my shoes on until watching Daddy Daycare. My mom also told me that the doctors said if I didn't go to the hospital, I would have went into cardiac arrest and died. That means I would have had my funeral on Halloween. I would have died Thursday, October 27th, 2005, and been buried on my favorite holiday, Halloween. Well, that is my story about how easy it can be to get carried away. Curiosity killed the cat, and it nearly killed me. Parts of my experience are humorous to look back on, but I did almost die. Took It in Jail by Spaz Melodic. I was in jail and lucky enough to be put on the litter cleanup crew. We would clean the side of the highway twice a week, which was always nice because we would find strange and unlikely things on the side of the road. Wallets, bags of pot, used condoms stuck to the guardrails shadowing the dirty highway we dangerously navigated to peel them away, grimacing as we placed them in little bags. Also, we often encountered unidentified bags of little pills which we took regularly after retrieving them from our rectums. I assume people had thrown drugs out the car window while being stalked by the highway patrol, and the wallets had been stolen and tossed aside the highway like thousands of fast food cups we relieved the nasty landscape of. One of my jail buddies saw some neat flowers growing on the bank about 3 yards from the highway, and he cursed with joy and gave me an evil grin as he turned to me and said, "Stuff as many leaves as you can into your ass, dude." I complied. He insisted, and being a dominant figure in our little circle of jail buddies, I saw no other option. I crammed what must have been 40 or more leaves into my rectum and bum crack. Bad move. On the van ride back to our lovely jail, I was talking to people who didn't seem to be there, according to other occupants of the cage van. I was quite high, yet high is a word that does this state of mind no justice in description. Later, I discovered that the rectum is a good way to administer psychoactive substances into the brain. How was I to know at that time? I was on psychiatric meds, Tegretol, SSR, antidepressant, Depakote, Seroquel, already, so the corrections officers paid no mind to my mumbling to invisible people. I exited the van in glistening chains while laughing hysterically at an old yet young-looking lady making faces at me and then vanishing in a haze that looked like exploding red glitter. She had no face, really. I could never articulate what I saw. Sorry, but some things are limited in a description through human language. Maybe this is necessary to maintain what we believe to be reality, but that's a whole other story. What I can say is that she looked amazing and like no other woman I had ever seen. So beautiful and, feline? That's not even close, but it's the best I can do. When we arrived to our cell pod, the culprit of my intoxication demanded I relinquish the contents of my rectum as he boiled a pot of water with what was then known as a stinger. A stinger was a relatively safe electrical device used in jails at the time to heat ramen noodles and such. Once the pot was bubbling, he threw the leaves in. He had many more leaves than me. He was a larger man and apparently had some extra room in his anus. A career criminal such as he, who had spent time in state prison, I assumed had a much larger rectum. For suspicious and disturbing reasons, "Is that all you got?" he barked in his deep and domineering voice. "Well, we can still trip hard so you straight," I quote. The idea of drinking something that has been inside someone's rectum is disgusting, I know. But we would do anything to mentally escape from the hell we were experiencing in jail, so we downed the lukewarm brew after he had boiled it for approximately 20 minutes. About 200 leaves and 30 ounces of water split between us we consumed in large, gut-wrenching gulps. Keep in mind that I was already high. I have little recollection of what happened before a 10-hour nap after consuming the foul beverage. I remember people laughing at me, yet too scared to laugh at the man who had brewed the evil concoction. I apparently was yelling at invisible demons and whatnot when I awoke, then being tied down in the infirmary while discussing the events of my life with something present beside me. It was explaining the events of my life that led me to the table I was strapped down to. The urine panel showed no illegal drugs in my system after 20 hours of consuming the tea. As I frothed at the mouth while speaking tongues to invisible entities, the staff didn't know what to do because I was having trouble breathing. "What did you take?" they repeatedly asked in demonic tones while trying to console me. All the people who I assume were actually there had my mother's face at one point, which was quite scary, yet morbidly comforting. I took the world. That's what I took. I remember repeatedly replying to the question the infirmary nurses who had asked what I had taken. I had tripped many times and was already suffering from HPPD from LSD use, so I attributed most of the psychosis to that at the time. This buzz was nothing like LSD though. I was dreaming while awake, yet awake in a dream. Sorry, but that's the only way I can put it. I was so intoxicated that I was near death, so I was taken to a hospital. The doc found out immediately what I ingested after a comprehensive blood panel. The doc administered things through my IV, which at the time I thought were extensions of my body, that I am certain that saved my life. I never found out what was administered through the IV, but I assume it was some atropine blocking agent. I had already given in to death at that point. I was told by an entity of shifting faces and voices of all my mistakes in life while the infirmary in jail. So I gave in to the guilt and what seemed to be cold hands gripping my neck and decided to die right there. I would have, I think, hadn't the staff of the jail rushed me to the hospital. Little did I know at the time my brooding friend who had poisoned us both, forcing me to stuff my rectum with strange leaves from the vicious and beckoning plant, was also in the hospital. He later described an experience to me which was so similar to mine that it was eerie, almost as if the plant was mad at us and decided to give us both the same punishment. My later inquiry into the nature of this plant was horrifying. It seems that Datura behaves very similarly to many who take it. There is something very supernatural about that plant, and this cannot be disputed in my opinion. It made me very sick, yet also enlightened me. When I was released from my stay, I felt like a different person. It had truly made me reflect upon my mistakes, and I was ready to do everything possible to avoid making them again. That is the positive spin on the horrifying experience. In a controlled environment with people who have not retrieved the drug from their anus in jail, Datura can be wonderful, I later discovered. However, I do not suggest taking it in jail. The strangest thing that happened months later after my experience, I was talking to my friend who regularly uses Datura. I mentioned a word and my friend uttered the same word at almost the exact moment I did. It is a word you will not find in any lexicon. what could be considered as a hapax. It was a word that was spoken to me several times by whatever entity was present during my trip. I doubt she believed me, but it shocked me that we said the same non-existent word practically simultaneously. Stoners have a tendency to do that from time to time in my experience. We giggled and passed the joint as I tried to forget the strange linguistic phenomenon that had just occurred. The familiarity of experiences I have found in reports is astonishing. I was tied down and unable to run around naked, but I was feeling the same things that others testified in describing their experiences. I was judged, prosecuted, and sentenced to death by her. Thank God that I was saved by a concerned jail staff. I cried, vomited, choked, spat on nurses who were not there, and ultimately died to the world as I had known it. Approximately 200 leaves between two people is a bit much. That much I know. She is as strange and unkind to people who stuff her into their rectums, after disrespecting her by carelessly tearing her apart on the side of a highway where she peacefully waits. As I recall, the plant was very inconspicuous, and it is strange that my scary tattoo-covered friend knew what it was. The surrounding Datura plants on the bank of the highway were in different stages of growth. I'm glad he didn't find any prickly seed pods. That would have been a very painful smuggle job. If he had told me to smuggle the roots of the marvelous plant and subsequently boiled and forced me to ingest them, I probably would not be typing this. Don't disrespect her. Methodical Damage by R1. I stumbled upon The Devil's Herb by accident as a teenager. It was offered to me by a dropout who I used to score hash from. As this guy didn't work, he had lots of spare time to spend reading books on many weird and wonderful things. Datura was one of them. He located the plant for sale in a local garden center. He went back that night to pinch it. The plant was always in his room, kept as a normal houseplant, and I often heard his stories about the infamous plant, the powers it held, and how it'd be ready to try when the pods were more developed. A friend and I visited him one day looking for hash, and he informed us that Datura had been harvested and a small group of people would be trying the brew. We booked our seat at the table and waited for evening to arrive. The brew was cabbage-like and bitter, not at all nice. Shortly after drinking, we fell asleep, except for my friend, who fought back the urge to pass out. I think I drank another cup of brew before passing out. When I awoke, I felt okay, a bit thirsty, but fine. My friend kept falling off the stool he was sat on. We decided to head home, and on the journey, my friend kept falling down non-existent trapdoors, shouting as he fell and then using his upper body strength to pull himself out. This happened several times on the way home. When we got back, my world changed. Although I was in a friend's living room, I thought I was in my bed and could not work out what his videos were doing in my airing cupboard. I found myself in his kitchen, naked, selling hash to long-lost friends and my dog Spike. These friends would appear and disappear, but in this strange world that was just their way of moving. They didn't need to walk, they were where they wanted to be. My friend got me out of his kitchen and settled me down in his living room, but I wanted to go outside and smoke imaginary cigs. I probably did that for an hour before crashing out. The next morning I awoke to feel normal again, or so I thought. I just wanted to get back to the safety of the familiar surroundings of my own room. I went to pick up my friend's phone to call for a lift home, but the phone teleported from one shelf to another. Each time I reached for the phone, it teleported somewhere else. On arriving home, all of the objects so familiar to me seemed to belong to me, but a me from another dimension. It was like I had returned from my trip but not landed quite where I left off. I was slightly out of sync with the world. I spent the next week on my own recovering from what I now know to be a near-death experience. I could interact with pictures and objects in my room. An Indian brave sculpture I had would answer deep and meaningful questions. I gave it either a knowing smile or a disapproving headshake. My hi-fi played tunes I did not own and had not heard. I took the dose on the Friday evening. I returned to work the following Friday but still looked that ill. My boss sent me home thinking I still had the flu that I was using as an excuse for looking so wasted and needing time off work. I could not read properly for days after and had extreme difficulty forming sentences. This slowly got better, but probably took 12 months for me to become confident enough in my speaking to address a stranger or talk to more than one person at once. That was about 9 years ago. My speech is now what it used to be. I can spot off funny one-liners to colleges without fear of stuttering my words or getting words in the wrong order. So as it caused long-term damage, well, all I can say is my ability to deal with life-changing events has gone. I recently lost my best friend due to a tragic accident and split from my partner, which sent me into a nasty place. Just like the place I was on Datura, an isolated place with only bad feeling and lost companions for company. It has completely changed my outlook on life, and in one way I am glad it did because I believe what doesn't kill me makes me stronger. But if I can go back in time, I would probably give that brew a miss and load, another bong instead. Dosed by Kids by Tom. I am 27 years old and I do a lot of venturing to the astral plane without the use of any drugs. I was looking for something to open up my mind even more. I am friends with the neighborhood teens and they told me of a flower that was growing in a neighbor's yard that they boil and drink to get high. They told me I should try it, so I did. They showed up that night with 7 fully blossomed flowers they were calling angel trumpets. They warned me over and over that the dry cottonmouth that occurs is severe and to have plenty of water around. They boiled the flowers in about 3 cups of water. I added a shitload of sugar to it, filled a large mug with ice, and poured the elixir into it. It was very yellow, like piss. It tasted fine with a weird aftertaste. They didn't want any for themselves, so I drank it down rather quickly. Upon finishing, they informed me that they had only had 1 flower when they got high. I immediately started to freak. I ran to the PC and tried to research angel trumpets ASAP. Then it hit me. My body started feeling buzzy. It was almost numb. I started getting a very dry mouth, I mean big time. So I tried to chug water. I tried to walk, but I kept crashing, and I mean crashing hard. It was as if something was slinging me around, throwing me into walls. I could not walk. I was falling over everything. I crashed for the last time in the middle of the floor, passed out. I had not hallucinated. I woke up in the AM to my alarm clock. I had to be at work. When I woke up, there were 5 mentally insane, deformed, mutated small people on my couch staring at me. They would not speak. They would hiss at me. I thought they were real. I went to get my shotgun and they started to disappear. I saw a lady with no arms or legs, but it was my lamp. The hallucinations were crazy. I drank the potion at about 10 p.m. that night. It was now 7 a.m. and I was seeing everything. I can go on and on about what I saw, but I feel it's irrelevant. I hallucinated in my car driving to work. I work at a desk all day by a window. I hallucinated till around 3 p.m. that day. My eyes were dilated severely. They still are, and it's 3 days past. Oh yeah, I woke up in a puddle of blood. My hands and feet were cut, and I have a 50-cent piece-sized chunk out of my right side of my ass. Some sort of a puncture. I have no idea how I cut myself. The best thing that has come out of this is the fact that I know what is going to happen about 3 to 5 minutes in advance. I can see stupid things that are no big a meaning before they happen. The thoughts just appear in my head, then they happen. I feel I had a major overdose and that I am lucky to be alive. My body is pretty torn up and I have no recollection of how it happened. Also, the day after, I could not remember anything short term. That was annoying. And my dog eyed me down when I awoke. He seemed like he wanted to growl at me. He was acting very weird. Oh yeah, I had managed to get to the bathroom in the midst of being thrown around. I tried to puke, but nothing came up. I had thought that I was going insane that morning, but now 3 days passed and I feel fine. Be careful. Do not overdose like I did. Be careful and have plenty of water around, and do not do it alone. A friend and I have been seriously into drugs for years now. We'll call him Chris. Between the two of us, we've tried nearly every drug that could even be slightly considered recreational. Drugs many of you likely have never heard of. Then came inevitably, deliriance. The day finally came where there were just no drugs left to try. After reading extensively, we turned to deliriance. We meticulously grew and picked Datura plants that we had grown and cultivated over an indeterminate stretch of time. The day came when the plant was ready to be ingested. We separated a significant portion of seeds, 600 apiece. Looking back now, the dose was absolutely ridiculous, and we are very, very lucky to be alive. I should be a dead man right now. The mentality behind the dose was something along the lines of, we're too experienced not to do this much, and our bodies are too used to drugs, etc. Essentially, we were too tough for Datura, and thus took a very stupid dose and a very stupid risk. Day 1. Jen, a friend of mine, came over to sit with us. We ingested 600 seeds each as quickly as possible and washed them down with a glass of milk. We then locked all the doors and windows to my house as to prevent any drug-induced rampages, police run-ins, or worse. Chris and I plopped down in front of my new big screen and began watching a movie. About an hour into it, I started to feel the effects. The dry mouth came on, as another trip reports. I had no idea it would be this strong. My legs felt like rubber and my body was completely out of whack. I looked over to Chris to tell him it was kicking in, and I found even this simple task disorienting. He confirmed the same experience thus far. In what was the stupidest move of the century, Jen decided she was bored and that she would take 150 seeds. Now, she's had her experiences with drugs before, but she was our sitter. 3 hours later. As time passed, it seemed to stretch. Much like a DXM trip, I lost all reference of time. The only indicator was a digital clock, which would have been impossible to read if it weren't for the large readout. The movie had since finished, and the television was airing some show about cops. I honestly couldn't tell you what it was I was watching, but all the lights and colors melded into this visual supernova that I could not stop staring at. Chris grunted strangely, and I looked over to see him sliding off the couch. I became frightened because at that very moment, the room had vanished. We were stranded on a couch in a burning hallway. I grabbed Chris and pulled him back onto the couch so that he wouldn't get burned. He looked at me with massive pupils and spoke an unrecognizable string of words. Time slowed as he spoke. His voice echoed in slow motion, and his pupils expanded beyond his eyes, spiraling toward me. I was intrigued at what I was seeing. When Jen grabbed my shoulder from the other couch, she was engulfed in flames and ran from the couch up into my bedroom. I laid on my bed trying to make sense of everything when I saw a man looking in through my window. Unable to make out his face, I was frightened. It was dark outside, and I was on the second floor. Impossible, but I believed it. Jen opened the door to my room. She shouted something and laid next to me. Her face twisted and turned as I stared, and I couldn't remember where we were. I must have blacked out because 3 hours had passed and I was still lying with Jen in my bed, only now we were both naked. Did we have sex? Why was I naked? What happened? I had no explanation, but somehow I didn't seem to need one. We tried to have sex, which is weird in itself since we had never so much as kissed before this. I was too far gone to know what I was doing, and then I went black again. Another 3 hours later, I came to, sprawled on my bedroom floor. I was now by myself. I noticed a residue on my body, leading me to believe that we had sex, but Jen was nowhere to be found. I walked into the kitchen looking for her, but there was no kitchen beyond my bedroom door. I stepped into a supermarket, only it was closed, and there was no food on the shelves. I ran back downstairs into the TV room where I had last seen Chris. The room was black. I saw nothing but a body hovering in midair. It was Chris, who seemed to be sleeping. I decided I needed a cigarette. Interestingly enough, I had one in my ear at the time. I smoked it and took another one from my now reloaded ear. Where are these coming from? I grew tired, but I still hadn't found Jen. I walked upstairs, and immediately upon opening the door, I needed to lie down. I thought I was in some kind of endless field and that I was sleeping on the grass. There I slept for almost 20 hours. I awoke, still hallucinating. I didn't know where I was or how I had gotten there, but it seemed to be a house that wasn't my own. I proceeded into the living room to come across a naked woman, Jen. She sat in her chair, talking to nobody. When I entered the room, she saw me and immediately took off running. Where did she go? Who was she? I needed to leave. I was in a strange house and I was stuck. I ventured into what I thought was a bedroom. It turned out to be a balcony. On the balcony, I found a man's clothing, but no man. Were these mine? I looked out into the backyard, and there on the ground was a man, naked. Somebody had fallen. Luckily, they landed in the water. I proceeded into the next room, intrigued as if I were investigating some deserted mansion. A radio hummed, though I saw no radio. I noticed a sliding glass door to the back, and I tried to open it. This was a strange door, and I couldn't seem to get it open. I felt trapped. I knew it was some kind of illusion. I jumped through it, and I was right. There was nothing there, and I was finally outside, free from the prison. There was a truck on the side of the road that I noticed from where I was standing. I decided to hitch a ride and try to get back home. I jumped into the bed of the truck and waited. Shortly thereafter, the driver got in, and we were off. I laid still, so not to attract attention, when all of a sudden, a friend of mine from high school appeared. I hadn't seen him in ages, but he was going to blow my cover. I remembered I was naked, and I didn't want him to see me. I tried to close my eyes, but he was still there. I shouted and tried to struggle with him, but he disappeared. The truck stopped. I was found out. The driver got out and saw me. He had no facial features, no mouth, no nose, and no eyes. I jumped from the bed and began to run, naked and scared. This is my last memory. There is no further evidence as to what happened after this point, but I awoke hours later, finally, somewhat sober. I opened my eyes, and there were 3 people staring at me. I was naked, bleeding, and covered in my own feces. I huddled in the corner of whatever room I was in. It was a family. They found me and tried to keep me safe. I was in southern New Hampshire after starting in Maine. I was almost 3 hours from my home with no recollection of how I got there. The family offered me clothing and enough money to take the bus back home. The aftermath. I returned home to find my house in ruins. The sliding glass door I had imagined was my bedroom window. Chris was lying on the ground in my yard after falling from the 2nd floor. He had no clothing on. He was alive, but he broke his right leg. I found Jen in my bathtub, still naked and sleeping. My life was hysteria for 48 hours. I'm not sure how all 3 of us survived that trip. If you don't mind, please like this video, and if you haven't already, please subscribe. Also turn on that notification bell so you don't miss any other uploads. Thank you. There was a film on at the cinema, and I thought I would take some Datura to make things interesting. I'd read something on Datura a while back saying how the user hallucinates and that these hallucinations seem real. I thought that if I took some, then the 3D hallucinations would complement the film and make for a great experience. So I chewed up a handful of the seeds before going in to watch the film, Scary Movie. Anyway, I was disappointed. All that happened was that the damn seeds sent me to sleep about halfway through the film. I woke up towards the end, and I felt that I had wasted my time. However, when I went to get up, my balance went, and I staggered down the steps of the cinema, wondering what the hell was going on. Feeling disoriented, I struggled to gain my balance and thought that maybe some food would do me good, so I headed towards a Burger King. I had trouble walking straight, and I remember one person saying, as I passed, "He looks like he's on drugs," and that person's companion saying, "Yes, you can always tell." This did not fill me with confidence as I headed into the burger bar. I decided to order a large extra value meal and sat down with my tray of food. I did not feel hungry, but felt that I should eat to give my body the ability to cope with the effects of the seeds. My first mouthful was a real effort. My saliva had almost dried up. I managed one more mouthful, but on the 3rd mouthful, The food just lodged in my throat, and it took a huge mouthful of Coke to shift it. I noticed now that an old woman and her grandson, who were sitting opposite, had stopped eating and were now just watching me. I happened to look down at this point and saw that my hands were bright red. The thought came to me that something weird and powerful was happening to me, and I should get the hell home as quick as possible. I quickly left and staggered through the crowded streets to the station for my train home. I remember thanking my lucky stars that the train was on the platform and due to depart in a couple of minutes. I sat down on the train and breathed a sigh of relief. The train departed. Unfortunately, sleep was overtaking me. En route to my stop, I drifted in and out of sleep. What was worse was that on waking, I found myself muttering gibberish to myself. I quickly shut myself up, saw that a couple of people on the crowded train looking at me, unresolved to stay awake, only to fall asleep again. One time I woke, the train was just pulling into my stop, and thanking my lucky stars again, ran for the doors. Well, I made the short walk back home. However, the home was a nearly deserted old nursing home, and not the most welcoming of places. As I walked up the corridor to the lift, I saw a man walking his dog. Then the man and the dog walked into a wall and disappeared. This was one particular moment that I will remember till the day I die, but I didn't want to hang around. I just wanted to get to bed and sleep off the effect of the seeds. Outside my room, a group of beings greeted me. I quickly realized that although they looked similar to us, they were not human. One male had a round head and an absolutely huge smile that suggested a mouth containing about 100 teeth. Another male had a face that smoothly merged into his neck with no chin whatsoever. A female had some type of microchip eyes. These characters greeted me telepathically. They then escorted me up the corridor and pointed out a hieroglyphic drawn in some exposed plaster on the wall and said that they had done that themselves. Around this time, I remember looking at the hallway carpet as I stretched up the hall thinking, wow, what a huge long dress that lady was wearing. Everything gets kind of hazy from now on. Several details are clear, however. Soon after I entered my room, two different beings presented themselves who communicated telepathically with each other. Some telepathic thoughts entered my head on occasions, the details of which I cannot unfortunately remember. I remember feeling extremely inferior and loudly stated that it was an unfair situation because I was having to rely on speech. I did telepathically communicate hello to one of them at one point. I got a look from both of them as if I had been making a rude gesture towards them before more telepathic communication was sent to me a few seconds later. I remember feeling that I should show some hospitality to my guests and went to the kitchen to fill a kettle to make some tea for them. I returned to my room, made 2 mugs of tea, and asked the being who sat in my armchair if he would like a mug. This being just sat there and looked at me. I put the tea down and said that if he wanted it, he should help himself to it. Shortly after, or maybe before, I was walking in the corridor when I saw more beings lurking in a dark unlit section of the corridor. I felt extremely uneasy about this and went to call on a friend who lived on the floor below. But just as I was approaching his door, I noticed more of these beings and I turned back. I hammered on the door of another friend. She answered and asked, "What is it?" My mind then went blank and I paused before blurting how the cleaner had emptied my cupboard of food. I don't remember her response, but she swiftly closed her door, leaving me in a state of panic. I decided to phone security. I told them how there were a couple of intruders on the premises. The security man put me through to the police. I said that there were a couple of dodgy characters in the building who were near me now. However, just as I was saying this, I began to feel some warmth to the beings and began regretting my call. The police had asked if they had made any direct threat to me, to which I replied that, well, no, they hadn't exactly. I then said that they probably had much more serious things to deal with and apologized. The policeman said a patrol car would come around anyway. I put the phone down and winced. I really didn't want the police to interfere and possibly endanger my new friends, as I had suddenly come to regard them. After a few minutes, I made my way to the front lounge where the TV was on. I had now realized that it was very late, in the middle of the night. There were 2 more beings in the lounge, watching TV. I peeked through the curtains and saw to my relief a patrol car pulling away. I turned back to the room and saw that the beings had stopped watching TV and were looking at me. I was now feeling thirsty and drank from the tap at the edge of the lounge. I tried to engage these beings in conversation, but they ignored me and just watched TV. I sat down and joined them. They communicated with each other, but ignored me. Occasionally, one or the other would vanish. I would turn to find one of them gone, and seconds later, reappear. By now, nothing was surprising me. Meanwhile, the last program of the night had finished, and there was just a text information service on the TV screen, as is normal for 4:30 in the morning. I joked to one of the beings whether he was a fan of the night screen information program. No response. I went back to my bedroom. The 2 beings who had been there originally were still there. They were now vanishing and reappearing. As time went on, they began to vanish for longer and longer periods, and I knew that they would leave for good soon. After a while, there was only one left, and he looked a bit sickly. I felt a little helpless that there was nothing I could do to help, and eventually, he disappeared for good. Feeling myself left on my own finally, my thought was unsure of what exactly reality was. I did feel privileged to have such an experience, and lucky that I made it home. The friend whose door I hammered on told me later that it had been 3:30 when I had knocked, 12 hours after swallowing the seeds. If there had been people around while I'd been prowling the corridors, then who knows what might have happened. I also think that there may have been a lucid dream element somewhere. I have now started doing exercise to facilitate lucid dreams, and on one occasion, as I was falling asleep, as my mind was throwing up hypnotic images, up popped one of the beings, one of the types with no chin. Well, I shot awake in bed with a start, and it took me a while to settle again. However, I suppose that if I manage to regularly repeat this, then it will be less of a surprise, and I may engage consciously with this being sometime. I would definitely recommend Datura to those broad-minded enough to cope with the otherworldly happenings. Was I flirting with schizophrenia, or was I engaging with the extraterrestrial beings? Whatever it was, it certainly opened my mind, and I will definitely be taking it again once more, once I have got to grips with lucid dreaming. This is the intuition telling me what to do now. First off, I'm not exactly sure what the dosage of the Datura seeds was, but it was around 250 seeds throughout the day. It all started at around 11 a.m. on a Saturday. At that time, I found some dead Datura stramonium on my land. The seed pods on most of them were open, but they still had a lot of seeds in them, so I gathered as many seeds as I could. When I got back to my house, I crushed up about 100 seeds and put them in a tea bag and dipped it in some really hot water. The water turned a yellowish green color, which I put sugar in and cooled it. I drank the whole thing around 11:30 a.m. and waited for an hour for the effects to kick in. And when they didn't, I ate about 75 more seeds. Then I got a little impatient after half an hour and decided to eat another 75 seeds to ensure that I got effects off baseline. An hour later, 1 p.m., the effects started to kick in. It wasn't very intense, but I did notice the effects. My pupils became dilated, my heart was beating at a rather fast rate, and all the fingertips on my right hand felt like they were numb and swelling. I had to be at work at 4, and since I didn't have any loss of motor control or any visual changes, I decided to just go to work without eating any more seeds. My pupils were still dilated, and my heart was still racing the whole time I was working. When I got off of work, I decided to go out and get some allergy pills to trip off of, since the Jimson weed failed at giving me any hallucinations. I am fairly experienced with the effects of allergy pills, and about 23 or 24 pills with 25 milligrams of diphenhydramine usually gets me to a good hallucinogenic state, but I've never talked to or even seen people that weren't there. until this night. I took 23 pills around 7 p.m., not thinking that they would intensify the chemicals in the Datura seeds. But maybe I should have thought about it, because I could have killed myself. Around 8 o'clock, I got a ride back to this party house I have, and the effects started to kick in. I got a really heavy feeling throughout my whole body, and I felt really tired. I didn't tell anyone at the house that I had taken anything, but I did start smoking this half joint that I had when I got there. I was sitting out on the front porch with one of my best friends while I was smoking it. After a few minutes of talking to him, he could tell I was really fucked up, because I would forget what he was talking about in the middle of his sentences, and I would constantly call him different names. His name was Jimmy, and I kept calling him Kyle, Sam, or sometimes Brandon. So I decided to tell him what I took, and he just laughed about it a little bit, and we just sat out there for a little while longer while I finished my joint. It was really hard to finish it though, because I would forget I was smoking it, and I would drop it all the time, and had a hard time finding it, because it was dark, and I would hallucinate a bunch of joints all over the ground. My friend usually had to find it for me. When I got done with my J, we went to the Kroger for some reason to see if my brother was working. We walked in, and I was walking beside Jimmy in the store talking to him. I later found out that Jimmy never walked in there with me in the first place, and I was talking to thin air. He was just outside the store laughing at me, talking to myself. This is the point where I stopped remembering. Jimmy said he came into Kroger and started asking me who I was talking to, and I asked him if he wanted to sell the van. Neither me or Jimmy have ever had a van in our lives, so he just walked me back out to the car. He said that when we got in the car, I started talking to someone in the back seat who wasn't there. I said it was my ex-girlfriend, and he said I talked to the imaginary girl for a long time, but he couldn't understand what I was saying. I was talking too quiet, and I was mumbling most of the time. The effects must have worn off slightly by the time we got back to the house, because I can remember getting back there and being there. When I got there, I started to talk to some people there who could tell I was really fucked up by the way I was talking, so I just told them I took some allergy pills. They would have been mad if I said I ate Jimson weed because it's poisonous. They believed what I said because I was acting like I usually do on them. While I was there, I remember picking up this container that was full of weed. I remember playing with the weed for a while, saying that we should roll it up and smoke it, but everyone said that there was nothing there. I remember looking at it and feeling it in my fingers, and it seemed so real. It was crazy. After a while of sitting there, me and my brother decided to go home, and all the way home, I was having slight dreams where I'd be in a conversation with someone and I would talk back to them, and the second I did, I would wake up and my brother would ask me what I was talking about, and I just said I didn't know. At one point on the ride home, I saw car lights in the distance that had said something to me, and when I talked back, they disappeared. It was nuts. When I got back to my house, I got in my room and started looking for something. I don't know what it was, but I figured I would remember when I saw it. I never found whatever it was that I was looking for, and I decided to go to sleep. I had a bunch of vivid dreams that night, and I couldn't tell if the events in my dream really happened or not. I was so confused in the morning. I was still seeing things in the corner of my eyes, and almost everything that moved was trailing that whole next day, and my pupils were still very dilated. I have stopped doing all drugs since this experience because I believed that I was close to death. I played with poison that night, and I believe I am very lucky to be alive today. I hope nobody else ever tries Datura or allergy pills. At the time of the intoxication, I didn't know the hallucinations weren't real, so it wasn't any fun at all. I microdosed on Datura for a few months, feeling no noticeable effects. Then like a ton of bricks, it all hit me, and I spent a year with what I can only call schizophrenia. I'd been experimenting lightly with Datura for a while. I'd add a bit of Datura leaf to a bowl of weed, but that was about it. I never wanted a full-on trip. I just thought it gave an interesting buzz. So I started growing the plants, and they make a ton of seeds. I started to eat 3 seeds a day. It was a nice little buzz, kinda like weed, but one thing I noticed was at the end of the month, I'd start to trip out a bit. Things would just feel really dreamy. It's hard to describe. I figured maybe all the seeds I had taken had started adding up and hadn't left my system. So I'd stop taking the Datura seeds for a few weeks, rinse, and then repeat. Well, one day, after maybe about 6 months of microdosing, I go into full-blown delirium. I remember being on the computer when something told me to Google a random string of characters. I did, and the only image that returned was a photo of an Arch Linux terminal that showed exactly what I was playing on my iPod, like I was being monitored. It was all downhill from there. Long story shorter, a couple trippy incidents. Thought I was telepathically talking to a famous actress. Then I thought I was telepathically talking to a woman who worked for the government. This went on for weeks. Then I thought it was actually an AI the whole time. I remember once closing my eyes and swinging an axe at a piece of plank in front of my foot, so I can test the precision of the AI and prove it didn't want to hurt me. Yeah, I nearly chopped off my toes. I also believe there were cars following me. Yeah, full-blown paranoia, except I thought they were there to help me. I stopped eating the Datura pretty early on into the hallucinations, but it took about a year for them to wear off. Took just as long for me to figure out that I was having delusions, and nothing from the past year had been real. I ended up being diagnosed a paranoid schizophrenic after having MRIs and stuff, but I refused any meds. Half of me still not believing I was hallucinating, and the other half scared of what the effects might be from the medication. About 2 years after the whole thing happened, I was back to normal. Obviously, it's hard to be sure what the hell happened here. Was it the Datura, or did I have a mental breakdown from something else? I can't say for sure. I don't take Datura anymore though, and I still smoke a lot of weed, and things are back to normal. Everyone says don't take Datura. Listen to them. I did Datura twice. The first time. It started slow, and first I started to lose balance. Everything that was close started to become blurry. I couldn't read my text on my phone, couldn't see the time. Then I kept forgetting where I was and what I was doing. Also, bad cottonmouth, like 10 times worse than weed. I also got onto a wrong bus, gave the driver all my money, and told him where to drive like I was in a taxi. Friend took my money from the driver and dragged me out of the bus. I was smoking one cigarette after another, but I didn't remember lighting any of them. I got a little pissed because I didn't have hallucinations. That is, until I saw that my pack of cigarettes was full. Later found out that that was a very common trip. But other than that, no hallucinations, and since that was the only point of doing Datura, I decided to chill out for a month and then take a higher dose. The second time. I decided to take the dose at 4 a.m., go to sleep, and set my alarm clock for 9 a.m., so I sleep through the bad part of the trip that starts 2 hours after ingestion and lasts about 3 hours. So I woke up feeling normal, eyesight surprisingly not as bad as the first time, like I was completely sober. Then, I see some girl sleeping in my bed. I start waking her up, and poof, she vanishes, and I find myself holding a blanket. I freak the fuck out and go ask the clock. Not a person, a clock, on my wall. What the fuck was that? And then I realized I was talking to an inanimate object. Freaked the fuck out again, forgot what I was freaking out about, and turned on the TV. While I was watching TV, I look at the wall on my left. A person jumps out of the wall, starts running, and vanishes into another wall. I jump from my chair and then I look at the clock. It says 3 p.m. I start freaking out because I was late for school. I get my backpack, lock the door, and see my friend. We chat and everything is normal. He says, "Dude, where are you going? It's Sunday. There's no school today." I start laughing and start going back to my house when I remember that my friend I saw lives about 10 kilometers from my house and his leg is broken. I turn around and he vanishes. I get back to my house, my mom and dad are home, no tripping. I talk to them and ask how the vacation was, small talk. Then I go to my room to get my cigarettes, get back to the living room, and they're not there. I call my mom to see where they are, and they say they are still on vacation. I freak the fuck out again, look at the clock, and it's 11:30 a.m. I remember it was 3 p.m. when I left home, so I figure it's worthless looking at the time if I didn't know if I'm hallucinating or the time is right. Then I talk to a glass of water for about an hour. I didn't use words. I could talk to it with my thoughts. I can't remember the conversation except how the glass was complaining about how much its life sucked. After that, I freak out because I was once again talking to an inanimate object. I get paranoid that I might do something stupid, so I lock myself in the house and throw the key through the window and go to sleep. Woke up at about 6 p.m., the trip was long gone. At least I thought so. I went out and chilled with friends, and then I see a couple walking towards us. Nothing weird about them, regular people like the friends I was chilling with, and then I blink and they disappear. And that was the last trip. I was normal the rest of the night. My overall comments on this. This is not a drug. It's more like an Alzheimer's plus schizophrenia. You have moments when you have no idea what is real, where you are, who you are, or what you are doing. But there are moments of clarity, as I like to call them, when you are lucid, just like people with Alzheimer's, and they don't last long. You have about a half a minute between two schizophrenic episodes. I think this is an attention whore drug, because you will not have a good time, but it will make a pretty damn good story. That is, if you survive it. My first experience with Datura stramonium at the age of 17 was very strange and life-changing. It all started one day with me and some friends visiting this very experienced drug user. Let's call him Steve. Steve was about 2 or 3 years older than me. He told us that he had found some Jimson weed near the local community college in the area we all lived in. He offered us to try some Jimson weed with him, but they were too scared and said not today. I was surprised because the two guys I showed up with were very experienced and had tripped on LSD and mushrooms with me many times before. At that moment, when they turned down the offer, I thought I would be brave and said I would try it. At the moment of my acceptance of ingesting the Jimson weed with Steve, I had done no research whatsoever on Datura and didn't even know the chemical name or the dangers of this drug called Jimson weed. Steve handed me a bottle cap the size of a normal 20-ounce soda bottle cap full of Datura seeds. Steve said there were roughly 50 to 60 seeds in it, and I quickly placed them in my mouth and chewed them up, then swallowed them with a small swig of water. After eating the seeds, Steve ate his cap full of seeds, then we all set off to go for a cruise and smoke some marijuana. When we got into the car, Steve pulled out 2 really fat joints of dried Datura leaves. Just as I had not declined the ingestion of the Datura seeds, I smoked joyfully the 2 fat joints with Steve until they were ashed away and gone. After hanging out with all my friends for a little while, I decided to go home and go to bed, a little disappointed that I was not tripping or hallucinating yet from the very large dose of Datura that day. Sometime during the night, I woke up and started hallucinating. I began talking on a non-existent phone in my room for many minutes, and I heard a voice on the other line. The rest of the night was blurry, partly from amnesia I later found out. But when daybreak came and light was outside of my room, the real hallucinations began to reveal themselves. The first thing that happened that morning was I noticed that I was smoking a cigarette in my room, and knowing at the same time that my house is non-smoking. I took a few puffs of the cigarette and blew the smoke out, and actually saw the smoke. Then a few moments later, I looked down at my hand and the cigarette wasn't there. Later on, I began to see one of my friends from high school that sat at my lunch table. He was sitting on my bed and we began talking, and I told him all about how Steve gave me Jimson weed and that I was hallucinating really bad at the moment. While talking to my friend that really wasn't there, my mother came into my room and said, "Who are you talking to?" After looking at her and realizing her question, I looked back at where my friend was sitting on the bed and was bewildered because he was not there anymore. This really confused me, and at that moment, I realized that I was having full-blown hallucinations. I told my mother I was talking to myself to placate her, then she closed my door. After this run-in with my mother, I tried to be more quiet and composed as not to worry her. After my mother heard me tell my friend on the bed that I got Jimson weed from Steve, my mother called Steve's mother and told her all about what had happened. Steve's mother told Steve, then one day at high school, Steve showed up and slammed me against the wall because he thought I ratted him out. I explained to him exactly what had happened and that my mother had overheard. He then understood and apologized. I closed my bedroom door to avoid any more confrontations of my distorted and loose reality with my mother's all-too-real reality. Later on, I glanced at my bed and saw 2 very beautiful girls that also sat at my lunch table that year in high school. They eventually dissipated into thin air like cigarettes. After all of these visions, I thought to myself that I better check my eyes and see if they are red and or dilated. So I went in front of the mirror and looked into it. Without even catching a glimpse of my face, my current history teacher was in place of my image, and he said, "Hey Andy, how's it going?" This really frightened me, so I sat down for a little and took a few deep breaths. A little later, I walked out to the kitchen for a drink of water. While in the kitchen, I looked over to the fridge and saw my brother was standing there in his boxers and a t-shirt and looking into a food-stocked fridge. I had noticed that with my other hallucinations, if I looked away from the actual hallucination that was in my vision and looked back at the place where the vision was, the hallucination would disappear. Just to make sure this image of my brother was real, I looked away for a split second and looked back quickly. I was amazed to see my brother was gone and the fridge door was completely closed. It was at this moment that I felt something was really wrong. My parents decided that the best thing to do was to go to the hospital. While they were taking me there, I was fully awake and clear-minded, except for 15 seconds during the trip where I had total amnesia. My parents later said that for 15 or so seconds, I thought my dad and mom in the front seats were the two guys that took me to Steve's house the night before, and then I began talking to my parents as if they were my friends. Directly after this slight amnesia, I snapped out of it and everything was normal the rest of the day. And I had no recollection of this 10 to 15 second memory loss. When I got to the hospital, my father waited in the waiting room and I was placed with my mother in a small room generally made for psychiatric inpatient holding in the emergency room. While waiting in the small room with the door ajar, I heard the sound of a heart monitor beeping like normal. After a few seconds, the beeping noises turned into one solid continuing tone of a long beep. After hearing this continuing tone, a few nurses and a doctor rushed to the room, but it seemed that the person died, because then I heard a few people crying and all the beeping noises stopped. This experience was very surreal because my mother had also heard and saw what happened to this person in the ER. A nurse eventually came into my room and told me that I had ingested a strong poison and that I should be okay because I was displaying no more symptoms of hallucinations. The nurse told me never to do this drug again. She offered me some medication to help me sleep, but I declined, and my parents and I went home. This experience with Datura was very strange, rewarding in a small aspect of life, but very dangerous. Hello, I'm reporting back. Finally, I'm safe and I'm okay. Sadly, I'm very messed up in my head right now. Doctors gave me depersonalization and derealization. I have regret my decision overall and that I shouldn't have done it. I was in the hospital for about 3 days, tripping. Here's what I remember so far. So I took the seeds. About an hour later, I got up confused, not knowing where I was or who I was. I was trying to text people on Reddit for my comments. I couldn't read or anything. I remember looking up and seeing a hanging man swinging like a GIF. Every time I looked away and back, it would restart. Then I stopped and blacked out. My father was screaming and I couldn't understand, but I remember the walls turned brown and everything was a brown world. I couldn't tell what was real or fake. The faces in the walls would say things to me like, "Kill yourself or die." I felt drunk, very drunk, and I puked everywhere. I think it was blood from the state I was in, but I have no idea. I saw lots of distorted people walking around in my home, speaking and screaming at me. I was scared because I didn't know if they were going to attack me or not. Finally, I blacked out once again, waking up to my father driving me somewhere. All I remember is the word hospital. I can't imagine what I put him through. I remember I couldn't see anything throughout the window, just blackness. Then I looked down and saw a little man running across the car floor. I kept laughing, thinking it was funny, but then I saw this entity. I'm not sure if anyone else has seen this, but it was a demon dog, like from Call of Duty Zombies, but it was sitting in the front seat, growling at my father, like it didn't want me to live it, and wanted to see me die. I recall smoking a lot of cigarettes too during the trip. Again, I couldn't tell you what was real or not. As we got to the hospital, I immediately blacked out. I was in the bed, then I woke up in another dimension. I saw thousands upon thousands of dead bodies stacked up on each other, going through into the sky, screaming lots of bloody screams, and blood was stained onto the walls of brownness. And that's really all I recall until I woke up with a horrid headache and the doctor telling me I'll be okay. If you want to try this evil drug, don't. I'm only 17 and ruined my whole life because I wanted to try this plant. I have no friends now and nobody's here for me. I'm so alone and I'm so done. I kinda wish somewhat it would have killed me, but I have my family and that's all that matters. Please do not do this drug. It's not worth it. Thank you for reading, and God bless.
It started as a typical weekend as a senior in high school. A few buddies and I camped for the night at Fossil Creek in northern Arizona. Nothing crazy. We spent the day swimming in the creek and had a bottle of Jack Daniels and 5 grams of bud to keep us entertained for the night. It was on the hike out of the canyon that things became interesting. As a drug-obsessed teenager, I'd not only tried my fair share of psychoactive substances, but had also studied the local flora for anything psychoactive. While hiking up the trail, I noticed a beautiful plant that I identified as Angel's Trumpet. I had looked into this plant just a little bit and couldn't recall much of what I had read. I just knew that the seed pods were the part that would make you trip. Being overconfident and completely foolhardy, I picked 6 seed pods off the plant and continued hiking back to my friend's car. When we arrived in the parking lot, I looked at my friends to see who wanted a trip with me on the Angel's Trumpet seeds. We had a couple-hour car ride ahead of us back to Phoenix, and I thought it would be fun to feel the come up and start tripping while we ventured home. It was a Sunday afternoon and my parents were going to be out of town until Monday morning. I figured I would have plenty of time to sober up from the trip before school or my parents returned. My friend Anthony, the most adventurous of the bunch, was the only one who wanted to take the seeds with me. Pussies, we joked with our buddies as we split the seed pods, 3 each, between ourselves. We emptied out the seeds onto napkins and looked at each other as we were about to unknowingly make the worst mistake of our lives. To this day, 4 years in the future, I still have nightmares about this experience and wish I could go back to this pivotal moment to stop myself. There were dozens of seeds in each of the napkins. We were so reckless and sure of ourselves that we didn't even bother to count them. Down the hatch, we swallowed them whole and washed the vile seeds back with orange Gatorade. We got into the back of my other friend's old Toyota 4Runner and hit the road back to Phoenix. It wasn't long before we started feeling the preliminary effects, and I was feeling nervous about what we had done. My limbs were starting to go numb, my mouth was drier than hell, and an overwhelming sense of dread and remorse was beginning to chip away at the fragile edges of my teenage ego. The Arizona step scene out the window passed through my field of vision in a haze, and I looked into Anthony's face to gauge how he was reacting to the sinister medicine we had consumed. Face is an index of mind. The words of the Indian sage to a young Terence McKenna reverberated through my skull as I saw the same nervous yet controlled expression on Anthony's face that I was projecting onto mine. For the time being, we were okay, but my mind was racing as the uncomfortable side effects continued to mount in intensity. Had we poisoned ourselves? Was that even the right plant? I don't even remember what this drug is supposed to feel like. Why did I get us into this? All of this spun around and around in my head while I did my best to remain calm and not let on to any of my friends that I was on the verge of freaking out. At one point, I had my friend pull over on the side of the highway so I could piss. My bladder felt like it was going to burst from all the water we had been drinking during the hike out of the canyon and the orange Gatorades we drank for the Datura seeds. But as I stood on the side of the road with cars zipping by, I couldn't piss more than a few drops. It was the worst sensation of trying to force the pee out, and even though I got out only a few drops, I strangely still felt relieved afterwards. By this point, the heavy body load, cotton mouth, and numbness in my arms and legs were in full effect, but Anthony and I weren't feeling much of anything in terms of psychoactive effects yet. We arrived back in Phoenix, and I was the first stop to be dropped off. I occasionally tripped acid and mushrooms alone back in these days, so my friends thought nothing of me being home alone for the rest of whatever this experience was going to be. If anything, they thought it was a good thing that my parents weren't around to catch me tripping on a random plant we found in the wilderness. I got out of the car, told Anthony to call me later that night so we could check in, and waved goodbye to my friends as I opened the garage door and stepped into my parents' empty house. From this point on, my memories of this experience are very fragmented and slippery. On a high dose of Datura like Anthony and I took, time ceases to be linear, fantasy and reality become intertwined and completely indistinguishable, and the tripper is brought to the brink of death to experience horrors and confusions that are too fantastic to encapsulate in English. I remember it being nighttime and I was outside in my backyard, sitting at the table next to the pool and smoking a joint with Anthony. We were shooting the shit, talking about nothing like we usually did during our smoke sessions, when out of the blue he said, "Look," in a serious, alarmed tone. Under the patio light, I clearly saw the irises of his eyes morph into an orangish gill pattern, like the underside of a psilocybin mushroom, and his pupils the size of dinner plates, black voids leading to I knew not where. I craned my head around, following his gaze, and saw the outline of a woman standing in the darkness on the opposite side of the backyard. "What do you want?" I blurted out in a shaky voice. I quickly glanced back at Anthony to reassure myself and check his reaction, but he was no longer there. I realized I wasn't sitting at the patio table or smoking a joint at all. The context had completely changed. I was standing at the edge of the backyard under the cool moonlight with my back up against the concrete block wall. The back door to the house was wide open, and the woman still stood in the dark on the opposite side of the yard. "Who are you?" I asked again, feeling unbelievably terrified, more scared than I had ever felt in my life. She didn't reply, but I mentally felt a response of, "There is no need to fear," as a flood of both disturbing and beautiful hallucinations came rushing over me. A river of violet energy crashed out of the sky like water and rushed around me and through me in a violent torrent. I felt I could barely stand, and I saw the strangest hallucinatory fragments flash through my mind. Demons peeking around windows, their bulging white eyes darting side to side in search of something. Tibetan Buddhists chanting in a monastery at the top of a windy, snow-covered mountain. The gears inside the engine of an alien spacecraft flying high above my backyard, observing my reaction and the contents of my mind. These images kept coming and coming, and I remember in flashes being able to actually see myself and the woman standing there in the backyard from a third-person, aerial perspective. After this episode of intense and delirious hallucination, I regained consciousness sitting in the dark in the middle of the backyard. I was extremely agitated, confused, and afraid, but otherwise felt relatively sober. This is just one of the sinister effects of Datura. You snap in and out of lucidity unpredictably throughout the experience, and there is never a clear "I'm coming up" or "it's wearing off" feeling to judge. I walked back into the house via the wide open door and frantically tried to reconstruct what I had been doing for the past several hours that I had no recollection of. I walked to my bedroom, and to my horror, upon opening the door, my mom and dad were seated on my bed, staring at me fixedly. Their faces were distorted and blurry, and my dad looked right through me and shouted, "What are you on?" in a voice that pierced the very essence of my being. I recoiled and turned away, knowing that I was busted, but when I turned back to reply, my parents were no longer there. The room was empty, the house was completely quiet. I stood frozen in the doorway, hearing only the blood rush through my body and a slight ringing in my ears, completely confused and overwhelmed by the entire experience. At some point in the silence, I heard the distant sound of multiple cars turning onto my street and slamming the brakes in front of my house. I was already paranoid beyond belief and raced to the living room to peer out the window and see who or what had come to visit me in the middle of the night. My heart sank as I saw 2 squad police cars parked right outside my driveway and an officer standing out in the road under the streetlight. Without even thinking, my immediate reaction was to flee the house and get as far away as possible. I ran out the back door and hopped the fence into my neighbor's backyard. The Datura had severely impaired my motor skills, and where I'd usually be able to hop the fence with no problem, I could now barely get myself up and over. From my neighbor's backyard, I went through their gate and kept running through neighborhoods until I reached the edge of the desert. This escape is like a fog of paranoia and insanity in my memory. I was running for my life through people's property, and I'm sure causing a ridiculous amount of commotion and noise in the dead quiet of a suburban Sunday night. My pursuers were morphing like a liquid in my mind. They started as the police, but at times I was running from demons or the idea of evil itself. I heard people on foot running after me. I would turn back while running and see pitch black shadow people in the distance. I heard the beat of big leather wings behind my right shoulder. I irrationally thought that if I made it to the desert, I'd be able to evade whoever was after me and hide out until daylight, but in reality, I had no clue where I was going or what I was doing. I had grown up in the area and knew every street like the back of my hand, but that night I would turn onto a familiar street and suddenly find myself in a different neighborhood altogether. Streets looped and repeated themselves. I would look down into the distance and see something random and impossible. I saw a middle-aged man laying out on a lawn chair, tanning himself, even though it must have been 2 or 3 in the morning. He lifted his sunglasses to look at me and gave me a wink before laying back down. I saw gigantic moths swarming around a streetlight and inexplicable lights in the sky. Everything was a fear-ridden blur. The next thing I remember is being restrained to a gurney and loaded in the back of an ambulance. The EMT looked down at me and had the head of a man and the body of a snake. It looked like the sun was setting behind his head. "What did you take?" he asked in a demanding tone. Through my cracked lips and parched mouth, I managed to reply, "Angel's trumpet." I looked down at my body and saw that my legs were covered in cuts and bruises. My shirt was ripped and filthy with dirt. It felt like an eternity passed on the ride to the hospital. I was confused as if I was being taken to the hospital, to jail, or being abducted by aliens. I later learned that at one point I asked the EMT why they were abducting me and when I could go back to Earth. I said all kinds of crazy things in conversation with the EMTs and people that I imagined to be present. In my mind, Anthony, or something that was impersonating Anthony, was in the ambulance with me for most of the ride and was acting like a guardian spirit. He would point to or pick up different medical devices in the back of the ambulance and explain what they did or how they were used. I would look down at my hands and see that I was holding a copy of whatever thing he was explaining to me, and then I would snap out of it and realize I was still bound to the gurney. There was an analog clock on the wall, and while Anthony was explaining it to me, it morphed into the wheel of samsara. I saw beings going through the never-ending cycle of birth and death, being born as animals, dying and reborn as angels, taking human births and being born as my family and friends. It was an endless cycle, all revolving around this wheel of existence within the clock. I felt as if I had died and was being held in some kind of waiting room, a transition place between worlds. Arriving at the hospital did nothing to sober me up. In fact, it took the better part of a week for me to return to my typical waking consciousness. The doctors forced me to drink a disgusting activated charcoal concoction, which must have been a complete waste since it had been hours since I had eaten the Datura seeds. They pumped me full of sedatives, antipsychotics, and other drugs to relieve my severe urinary retention and tachycardia. They also inserted a catheter, which was as horrifying as you would expect while under the influence of Datura. I won't even describe that horror here, and will instead leave it to your imagination. Under sedation, my delirium continued, and I phased in and out of waking consciousness with varying levels of lucidity. At some point, my parents arrived home from their vacation and had to return to their son seemingly on the brink of death, lying insane in a hospital bed. I will never forgive myself for putting them through that stress and all of the trouble I caused from this stupid decision. In my sedated delirium, intense hallucinations continued as I fought for my sanity. A black Labrador came in and out of my hospital room, and the jingling of his collar would trigger waves of visions and views through poison kaleidoscopes behind my closed eyes. I could see him trotting through the hospital and his tail wagging back and forth as he passed the rooms full of suffering mankind. Any room he lingered on was an ill omen of that person's approaching death. I had the impression that Anthony was with me during this part of the trip. He was no longer acting as a guardian spirit like he was in the ambulance, but instead was by my bedside, or in the hospital bed next to mine, or standing out in the hallway on the threshold of the room. It wasn't until later that I learned that Anthony had been hospitalized as well earlier in the night. After Anthony was dropped off at home, it wasn't long before he started hallucinating and acting strangely. His mom caught him talking to imaginary people in their kitchen, wildly gesticulating and saying things that didn't make any sense. Anthony later said that he thought he was being interrogated by federal agents about his involvement in the local drug trade. Anthony was a low-level weed dealer at our high school and was always very paranoid about being caught. When confronted by his mom as to who he was talking to, he panicked and tried to run out of the house. She caught up to him fumbling with the lock on the front door, and when she tried to restrain him and calm him down, he turned around and punched her square in the face, thinking that she was one of the agents trying to arrest him. After that, the actual police were called, and Anthony was restrained and transported to the same hospital I would be admitted to several hours later. After our stay in the hospital and return to relative normalcy, Anthony and I were both sent to a psychiatric ward on a 72-hour involuntary hold. It took almost a week for me to feel normal again. I thought my eyes were never going to heal, and I worried that I'd given myself permanent psychosis. In the days that followed, I saw gnomes marching across the floor in the psych ward like little ants. I would stare at them for minutes, observing them closely, then briefly look away, and when I looked back, they had vanished. Small hallucinations like that and tricks played in my peripheral vision continued far longer than I ever wanted. This experience placed a permanent strain on my relationship with Anthony and my parents. I felt I had let everyone down with this stupid decision and ruined our lives. I remember standing under the hot water in the shower, staring down into the drain and feeling the water flow over my skin like rubber and thinking that things were never going to be normal again. This experience was 4 years ago now, in April of 2019, and things did eventually turn out alright. With time, my vision and mind repaired themselves and my parents forgave me. In August of that year, both Anthony and I went off to different colleges and have since lost touch. I thank God that no one was seriously injured or killed. After the fact, I learned from my parents that the police had never been called to our house and that instead multiple people in the area had called because I was making so much noise during my frantic flight from the demons in the middle of the night. Taking Datura rips apart the fabric of our consensus reality and exposes the tripper to the spirit realm, but what you find there is not at all pleasant or harmless, especially if you are as unprepared and naive as I was. It is much more a glimpse of hell than of heaven, and I now feel that I have permanently opened a door that cannot be shut in this lifetime. I frequently dream about this ordeal and have flashbacks to the visions I experienced that night. I still feel that woman standing in the darkness, observing my life from a distance and occasionally showing herself in my dreams to this day. In this story, OP identifies the plant as Angel's Trumpet, which is not Datura but very similar Brugmansia. He called it Datura for most of the trip, so I do believe it actually was. I think the self-identification was wrong at first, and he later realized it was Datura. Alright, I just wanted to clear that up because I don't want people in the comments saying,
well, actually, Angel's Trumpet is Brugmansia. You should learn before you start making videos. This is such a stupid channel. I hope you die.
Alright, that's all I wanted to say. Have a good one.
Datura permanent damage warning. Hi, I joined to share about my 50-year-old brother's experience with Datura 6 months ago. It is important to understand that he was living with a brain injury when he took Datura, so he had a much weaker brain than a healthy person. Even alcohol can have many times stronger effects on damaged brains. That brain injury occurred 5 years ago due to his drunk driving and disabled him physically and mentally to the point where he could not work. He could, however, find his way about town, use the internet to surf and email. He had mood problems, but if you did not know him on a good day, you might not realize he had any mental problems, even after talking to him for 30 minutes, aside from his poor hygiene. Anyway, 6 months ago, he emailed me the following. Little did I know this is the last time he would be able to email me. A few hours later, the owner of the care home he lives in called to say he was having full-body seizures. He then stumbled into the street and dislocated his shoulder and scraped himself very badly all over. An ambulance took him to a hospital where they assumed his seizures were related to his old brain injury. It didn't occur to me until later that night to mention the Datura flowers. They had no idea about Datura. Even the doctor had hardly heard of it. They treated his seizures over a period of few days. We believe he ate an unknown quantity of flowers. Seeds too? But the hospital had no toxicology test for it. When he was able to talk a few days later, he was still hallucinating. He was saying there were birds in his room that were talking to him, etc. He had no idea where he was. He actually thought it was the 1970s. These hallucinations went on for almost a week in the hospital. Some were actual hallucinations, and others were just his scrambled brain making up best guesses to questions. In total, he spent 2 weeks in the hospital and another week in physical therapy for his shoulder. When he got out, his memory was much worse. He hardly knew where he was living, what year it was, etc. He didn't use his computer anymore. I expected him to start recovering 3 or 4 weeks later, but he never did. It has been 6 months since the day he took Datura. 6 months ago, the following changes occurred. He lost the ability to use a simple mobile phone. He doesn't even know how to turn it on. Whereas before, he would call people daily with his mobile phone. He lost the ability to use the internet and email. I asked him to email me once and he just typed the address on his keyboard, never loading up a program or anything. He lost the concept of how a day works. For example, if I tell him he gets money on Thursday, he will call me 10 times complaining that his watch has been stuck on Wednesday for days. He believes every weekend that his friend is coming to move him down south. He has not spoken to his friend in 6 months. He has remembered and talked about his child only twice. He used to speak about him every day. And he has no memory of the Datura trip or hospital stay. Anyway, I wanted to share that as a warning and just as some information. To be honest, there is one positive side effect to this sad outcome. He is less depressed and agitated than he was prior to taking Datura. I think this is simply because his brain is working at much reduced capacity and he's unable to think through much anymore. He can still walk to the corner market and buy cigarettes and soda. This trip lasted for 3 days, by Gonzo. This is a story detailing my couple of experiences with Datura root. My friends and I had read about it in Carlos Castaneda's books. It was a sacred plant to the Native Americans, and they would take only a small part off of the very tippy end of the big tube root of the plant. And they had a purification process for it, also that lasted a couple days before they would ingest it. They believe that plants like Datura or like peyote have a spirit that is associated with it. They believe that the spirit of the Datura plant is very powerful and often will overtake the person who takes the plant. Well, my friends and I were in California and noticed the plant all over the place by its beautiful, fragrant flowers. We gathered a root and went out camping in the high desert. My friend Donnie decided to make some tea out of part of the root, while I and another simply took a bite out of the small end of the root. After a half hour seemed to pass without any effect other than the worst cottonmouth ever, we decided to eat some more of the root. Another half hour or so and I decided that this stuff sucked and was going to lay down in the tent. On the way I drank some of Donnie's tea. The next thing I know, I was waking up and thinking that I really had to pee. It was nighttime, but when I stepped out of the tent it was a beautiful sunny day outside. It was cool because as I went towards some trees to pee, I found that the trees had faces and I could talk to them. There was also this large rock just off the trail and it turned out to be hollow. That's right. And not only that, but someone actually would hide it under it and they could see out through it and would spy on people hiking the trail. I was having a whole new world revealed to me in this delusion. It didn't seem like I was tripping, only that this was reality that I hadn't been able to see before the spirit of the Datura became my ally. Then I saw a couple of my friends. They didn't speak out loud to me, but it was like we all knew each other's thoughts and we decided to play hide and seek. But not just normal hide and seek. We could turn invisible. So this went on for a long while, and I got lost off talking to the trees and mountains and finding whole little worlds I hadn't known before, little people living in the trees. This trip lasted for 3 days. I didn't think I was tripping. On the third day, my friends were saying, "Nice to have you back," and they related to me that I was pretty much gone from reality for the last 3 days. I then realized that this had not been reality, and the spirits in the trees and the little worlds, withing worlds, that lived in the holes of the trees were not real. I was astonished. None of what I experienced was real at all. At one point, we had gone out to breakfast. I actually had this little window pop up in my peripheral vision that would show me the translation of any word on the menu into whatever language I wanted. My friend said that I sounded like I was speaking in perfect dialect of German, Chinese, and some other weird made-up languages too. honestly felt like I knew language and I could speak it too, fluently. Another experience I had with Datura was on the coast of California. The most notable parts of this trip were that I had remembered going to the ocean and leaving my sweater there, and my friends insisted that I never left their sight, and that we did never go into the ocean. Well, my sweater was missing several days when I saw it on another friend. I asked her where she got it, and she said she found it on the beach. The most amazing, although frightening thing that happened though, every one of my friends and a police officer saw what happened. A cop saw me running around and stopped to ask me some questions. My friends came over and he told them that they needed to keep me away from public in the state I was in. I was squatting at his feet saying that I had to plant these good seeds and eat the bad seeds, and this seemed to annoy him quite a bit. So he put me in the back of the cruiser with cuffs on while he spoke to my friends. I remember having the thought that I really wasn't comfortable in the car and wanted out. Next thing I, the cop, or my friends know, I am mysteriously out of the cop car without cuffs and eating bad seeds and planting good seeds. At the cop's feet again. He grew afraid and eyes widened. As he ran away and got in his cruiser, he yelled that he didn't want to see me again and to keep me under close watch. Datura is amazing, but causes delusions and complete other worlds to seem like reality. There was another kid we met while in California who said that he'd done Datura several times before. He seemed that he was locked in this other world of unreality, and although very nice kid, always weird smile on his face and little chuckles for no reason. I think that the spirit of the Datura took him over. Be careful with this plant, it is not a toy.
First off, I would just like to say, never, ever do this drug. The high was impossible to describe other than scary, feverish, and delirious. My brother showed us a plant one day and said he had read about it on this website. He told us that if you eat a pot of seeds, you get a trip similar to mushrooms mixed with acid. Since I have never tried acid, and I have never had mushrooms work on me, I was quite curious to try it, especially since it was free. Me and a few friends picked about 10 pods and went to my friend's house. His parents were gone to the cottage for a couple of weeks, so we decided it was the perfect time. We had sniffed a pill or two of E, and it wasn't really affecting me too much, so we started the adventure. We took the seeds out of 4 pods and crushed them in a mortar and pestle. We then boiled the seeds for about 20 minutes and put the seeds and water into a tea kettle and put 2 tea bags in it to sit. We let it sit for about 10 minutes and the 4 of us prepared our first cup each. We added lemons to it since the seeds had such a bitter taste. We drank 2 cups each, and then me and one other friend split the 4 pods of seeds between the 2 of us. The E was just getting to the peak when I had finished the tea, and I went outside for a smoke. I got outside about 5 minutes after finishing the tea, and that's when we ate the seeds. In about 10 minutes after I finished my smoke, I started getting dizzy and feeling very frustrated. About 10 more minutes passed since I had consumed the actual seeds, and now I could not control my vision at all. Shadows and darker objects would blend into each other, and everything seemed to move to the right. I was now beginning to hallucinate and started to get very scared. I was later told that I was curled up into a ball, sitting on a chair on the front porch, talking to myself and drooling. During this time, I remember talking to 5 bikers who came to the house looking for me and my friend to beat up. I was scared, so I went into the fetal position and fell off of the chair. And when I stood up, all my friends appeared out of nowhere. They weren't there when the bikers approached me, and they asked me if I felt the Datura yet. I suddenly felt a lot less alone, and somehow I was practically sober again. My vision returned to normal for the moment, and I could have a conversation without mumbling. I was asking my friends if they were feeling it yet, and they all said no, except my friend who I split the seeds with.
Everyone then went back inside except for me and my friend who was tripping, and I started to feel it again, but this time it was much more potent. I started to see squirrels and raccoons all over the front yard, and they seemed to have spotted me. They all stopped to look at me and began running at me. I again curled up into a ball and rolled around on the ground as they attacked me. When I noticed that I felt no pain, I looked up to see 4 cop cars stopping in front of the house. Scared that they saw me defending myself from imaginary animals, I lit up another cigarette and tried to play it cool. As I looked up after sparking the smoke, the cops had disappeared and a dragon was floating in front of us. My friend then jumped to his feet and screamed, "Look! They threw him off the balcony! The fat guy threw him off the balcony!" He then looked at me with the most serious look on his face and said, "He's dead, man. We should call the cops." I don't know if this really happened, but he picked up his shoe and tried to dial 911. When nothing happened, he threw the shoe across the yard and ran into a bush and started crying. By now, I was starting to realize that almost everything was an illusion, but it seemed so real I could not separate them from reality. A feeling of aloneness, anxiety, and severe restlessness. When I looked at the bush to see if my friend really ran and hid there, I saw a little girl hung from a tree branch with blood coming out of her mouth. I turned around because I was pretty sure it wasn't real, and she was standing inches away from my face, screaming. I then started to cry and wanted to get off the drug as quickly as I could. As most other users of Datura have noted, my mouth was really dry and my throat burned. I decided it was time to go inside where my friends could comfort me and try and help me get off my high. As I said before, I felt like I was being trapped in a really small place, and my skin felt like it was burning and itching. I was in severe physical and mental discomfort. I remember dropping to my knees and praying to God to help me get off of the drug. I drank about 5 cups of water simultaneously. I felt something wet on my feet, and I looked down to see myself standing in a pool of water. From my earlier experiences, I realized rationally thinking and turning away from what I was visualizing would get rid of my hallucinations. I drank 1 more cup of water and decided to go watch TV and try and focus my attention on something real. As I was in the kitchen drinking the water, I could see all of my friends sitting around the table, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. I wandered to a secluded room and sat down on the couch and turned on the TV. I was now feeling more confident, but the anxiety and burning of my skin and mouth continued. I was watching Jerry Springer, and I could hear muffled voices, but couldn't understand what they were saying. I then started feeling very angry and frustrated, so I looked to see who was talking. As I looked over where the voices were coming from, the voices became clear, and I was in a room filled with all my friends who were not in there moments before. They were yelling and rolling joints, and I kept yelling as loud as I could, "Shut up! Shut up!" Then I looked towards the entrance of the room, and my friend was doing cartwheels. I looked back to see if anyone else noticed my friend doing cartwheels, and the room was empty, and the TV was not even on. I could clearly remember the episode of Jerry Springer, and I was now becoming very scared and uncomfortable. The next thing I knew, I woke up to the sound of knocking on the window. I looked over and saw nothing, and then looked again, and 3 burnt faces simultaneously popped up to the window, screaming. I then actually woke up in cold sweats and felt the sudden need to vomit. I tried to stand up, but fell flat on my face. After putting all my energy into it, I got up and wandered to the washroom, bumping into every wall on the way there. My friends who were sober asked me if I was alright, and I tried to say yes, but I just started screaming in pain. I felt as if I was dying, and I ran into the washroom. Every movement I made sent a rumbling effect throughout my whole body. I tried to throw up, but all I could do was cough and burp. I wanted to get the Datura out of my system, so I shoved my fingers into my throat, trying to vomit. Nothing would work. I was crying and shaking, and my skin felt as if it was on fire. After 10 minutes, the nausea wore off, and I went back to the couch I was sleeping on. Again, I felt as if I was going to vomit and repeated my last mission to the washroom, but could not get myself to puke. I then started punching myself in the head and knocking my head off walls, trying anything to make myself sleep. Nothing would work. I then vomited all over myself and passed out from the numbing in my brain. I woke up in heaven, flying through clouds and rainbows. I saw all of my friends I was with above me, looking down with very concerned faces. I felt as if it was a warning, telling me that I was almost on my deathbed and that I was messing with very dangerous substances that I was not educated on. As I floated around, my life was flashing through my mind, like in a movie right before you die. I saw my family at my funeral, all crying, and my friends as well. I was speaking to a voice that was telling me this is what will happen when you waste your life away. The voice said that this time I was lucky, but next time I won't be. I then was back, floating through the rainbows and clouds, and I wished I could be there forever. I decided this wouldn't be the last time I tried Datura, since I could not recall any of the events that previously happened. But then I saw the concerned faces above me, and reality set in, and the faces were real. I was lying on the washroom floor with puke all over me, and my friend was screaming at me to wake up. I stumbled back to my bed and passed out, relieved that I was alive. All the illusions had now stopped, but the burning was still present. It felt as if my whole body was sunburnt and itchy. I woke up the next day and looked at my watch to see what time it was. All I could see was a blur. Now, sober enough to know it's real, I was truly frightened and believed I had gone blind. For the next 6 hours, I could not read anything 2 feet in front of me. Anything past that was perfectly clear. It has now been approximately a month since I did the Datura, and the effects are still present. I still sometimes have trouble seeing, and in the dark, I still see shadows move and blend into each other. I have very realistic dreams that are hard to distinguish from reality, and I may believe that some of my dreams were real. I now talk during my sleep because of the vividness of the dreams, and my skin is still sensitive. This is my experience on Datura, and I will get my friend to also write up his experience, since he consumed Datura 4 days in a row after that night, against my wishes. I'll let him elaborate on the details, but his experience was much more unbelievable than mine. My first mistake was using a tablespoon instead of a teaspoon, per the directions I had read in some booklet. I lived in Kansas at the time and found the Jimson weed, which has a stem resembling balsa wood and green pods that have a few spikes on the outside, maybe 30 per the golf ball size pod. I split the pod open and it had a quantity of flat, round seeds reminiscent of apple seeds in the color, and small cucumber seeds per the size and shape, perhaps. I washed down the tablespoon of seeds with a glass of water and waited. An hour went by with no effect, so I smoked a bit and drank a couple of beers, chalking the experience up to urban legend. I remember glancing towards the bathroom and seeing about 20 vividly colored coral snakes pouring out of the drain on the floor. I began to freak. I looked at my stereo speakers on the floor, and through the black mesh fabric cover, I could see what looked like a scene from the movie Williard. Rats scurrying from the bottom to the top to some impossible place beyond. One stopped, looked at me, and urged me to come on, let's go, via hand and body language gesticulations. To escape the snakes in the bathroom headed my way. I was paralyzed with fear and stunned beyond belief. I had done a lot of LSD, mescaline, microdot, you name it, but no synthetic hallucinogen had ever been even anything like this. I remember having an incredible thirst. A friend came over who tried some also, and the visions disappeared, and I felt normal again. We drove to town in my car, me driving like an idiot, and somewhere along the way, got seriously lost. Suddenly, it was nightfall. I have no idea where the missing 5 or 6 hours were spent. I suddenly discovered I was crawling on the guardrail portion of the bridge, 70 feet over a river. I remember running through a woods after ripping my shirt off and forcing my way through an electrical fence. It left marks on my hands and chest. Also talking with the horse for about 20 minutes. It was using ESP to talk to me. I saw what I called flat rabbits all over the ground. Imagine a rabbit run over by a steamroller like in Mad Magazine, but the head's not smashed. The rabbits were staring at me like their tortured condition was my fault. They couldn't move, they just whistled real loud. I went to my car and got in the passenger side, and as I tried to shut the door, a snapping turtle attacked me. I fought with it, threw it out the door, and as I slammed the door shut, it jumped in, and I smashed it with the door. Turtle guts and blood were everywhere. Then, they weren't, and lucidity returned. After that, I had lost my keys to my car. As I was walking back towards civilization, reality went on vacation again. The next thing I remember was pulling myself out of a river and walking up to a house. I was a competition swimmer my whole childhood, so this would not have been a big feat when not under the influence. Somewhere along the lines, my friend showed up again, and we went to the first house we saw. We started throwing stuff from his front yard into the back of his pickup truck, like a metal tractor wheel, huge rocks, etc. I don't know why, but at the time, it seemed pretty important. I woke the owner of the house up 3 times, thinking I was at my boss's house. "Hey, is so-and-so here?" "Oh, sorry." And then I just walked right in. Finally, the police came. They figured I was drunk, and now, a full 17 hours into the trip, I was getting longer and longer bouts of lucidity, which helped me say things that made some type of sense. He called a tow truck for me to get my car, which amazingly, I was able to describe where it was. So, the cop drove me home, with me, all the while mashing my imaginary gas and brake pedals as he drove home, with me in the passenger seat. The next day, I could barely see. My vision was completely blurred, and I was unable to focus at all. It took a couple of days before my vision returned to normal. My recommendation on Jimson weed if you want to get high and want to do a real trip full of hallucinations is to definitely stay away from anything based on belladonna. In other words, this is a definite, don't try this, period. I have never done it since. I am 42 now, and never will again. It wasn't cool, it wasn't fun. I was 100% out of control, and anything could have happened that I would have to live with the rest of my life with. Anything could have happened. In my misspent youth, I did every drug known to mankind in those days, and that is one I would never touch again. Same with PCP. real dangerous, out of control stuff when the dosage and purity is high enough. Before this next story begins, the guy says that it's morning glory seeds, but Arrowwood changed it to be Datura, so what you're reading here is a Datura report. He just got it wrong. And also, if you made it this far, give my video a like, and check out my other videos too. Subscribe if you haven't already as well. Thank you, and let's move on to this story. I stopped by my neighbor's house for a few beers. When I walked in, he was brewing an herbal tea made from the morning glory flower. He said it was similar to a light acid trip. Although I hadn't heard of it before, I was in a good mood and thought, what the hell? I'd known him for a couple of years, and we had taken LSD numerous times together. At 11 p.m., we strained the tea he had been brewing the last 2 hours and drank a cup each. There were 3 other friends at his house, but we were the only ones to take it. It tasted awful, but we still did it. He threw up his portion about 45 seconds later. I didn't. 4 minutes later, I was having the most intense trip of any peak I had experienced, and I knew this wasn't going to be good. I decided it best if I just try to go to sleep immediately. The next thing I knew, it was 3 p.m. the next day. I awoke in my own living room with my girlfriend and 2 roommates sitting next to me on the couch. All I knew at that moment was I had horrible dreams from the night before and that my vision was extremely blurred. Their first response to me was, "Welcome back." I was then informed I had not slept at all. To the contrary, I was full speed the entire time, but had lost the ability to talk in any manner close to English or have an attention span of more than 10 seconds. From what they tell me, I was found in my neighbor's bathroom at 3 a.m., scratching paint off the wall with the sink overflowing. Inside the sink was a plugged-in hairdryer. The rest of the night was a living hell for everybody around me, from what I'm told. I won't go over the more than 20 or so similar things I apparently did that night. That night was no more different than a normal night of nightmares to me. I do vaguely remember some things, but exactly like I remember a dream from the night before. As bad as that night was, it pales to the after effects, some of which are still with me. It took 3 days to regain my vision back to normal. In an interesting side note, although my vision was severely impaired, I could see individual windows on buildings 25 miles down the coast. It was like having the vision of an eagle at far distances. The worst side effect is one I am still living with: my mind. 2.5 years later, and I have a hard time concentrating or solving complex problems that were second nature to me before. It was really bad the first year, but I'm 90% back to normal. In addition, there was the onset of panic attacks, depression, and a lack of motivation. These too have gotten much better. I wish I had never tried that herbal tea, and so does my neighbor. Despite throwing it up immediately, he too had a trance-like experience with milder after effects. We both have pledged to never let anyone go through that experience if we can help it. We still do take LSD once in a great while with normal trips. I can't say anything about the seed method, but recommend never brewing the plant. This had happened shortly after Christmas of 2020, and I hardly had any drug experience at that time. I had heard good things about psychedelics at the time and became very interested in shrooms, so I started asking my friends if they knew anyone. My friend, who we'll call O, told me, "Yeah, I know a guy. He can get you some stuff to make you trip balls." So I said sure, and he gave me his Snapchat. I waited a few days before messaging him since I wanted to do it on the weekend. I didn't want to be bothered during my first ever trip. Saturday comes along, and I messaged the guy, who we'll call D, and told him I would like the shrooms. He said sure, and said I would only need 1 gram as a starting dose, and that I would owe him $10 for it. We decided to meet at a McDonald's, since there's one less than a half a mile away from my house. So I grabbed a $10 bill out of my wallet and started walking to the McDonald's. When I got there, D was already waiting there for me, so I said, "What's up?" And he said, "You got the $10? I nodded and handed it over to D. D pulled out a bag with a few small brown spiky pods in it and gave it to me. I said to D, "What the heck are these things? I thought you had mushrooms." D said, "Yeah, I thought I did, but these are way better. It's Jimson weed. They are similar to shrooms." So I reluctantly took the Jimson weed home and ate them in my bedroom. The pods tasted very bitter, and I could barely finish them without almost throwing up due to gagging at the taste. About 30 minutes later, my mouth began to feel very dry, as if I hadn't had anything to drink for 3 years straight. So I chugged 3 cans of Dr. Pepper, but to no avail. So I decided to try and listen to some music to get my mind off it for a while. So I powered on my laptop and tried to go on YouTube. This is where the hallucinations began. All the text on my screen became a jumbled mess, almost as if a toddler had typed random letters on a keyboard. At this point, I stood up, and my legs instantly felt numb, and I fell to my knees. I tried to stand up again, but I only fell back down. I started hearing a scratching noise at my bedroom door, so I checked it out, only to see a golden retriever dog sticking its tongue out and wagging its tail at me. So I reach out to pet it, but I feel nothing. No fur, nothing. At this point, I realized, wait a minute, I don't even have a dog. I tried to stand up again and finally managed, but my legs were extremely wobbly and I could barely even walk. I'm not sure why I thought this was a good idea, but I thought going outside might help clear my mind. Boy, was I wrong. Very, very wrong. Upon opening my front door, I see that the sky had turned crimson with black clouds. As I'm walking down the street, I see my friend, who we'll call P, with a gun pushed up to his head, and he says, "I'm tired of life. I'm killing myself." I begged him not to go through with it, but it was too late. He pulled the trigger, and his lifeless body fell to the floor. At this point, I started to cry uncontrollably, since I assumed that my friend, since I had known since childhood, was gone forever. Halfway through my tears, I see a goat walk up to me. The goat stood up on its hind legs and became the form of the devil. He spoke to me with a horribly, ghastly, evil voice and said,
"This is your fate. You are now in hell for all eternity. God cannot save you now."
Shortly after, the devil dissipated, and I heard evil laughter as I saw Jesus dead on the cross, burning. At this point, I think, fuck this, and tried to go back home. It was still very hard to walk due to my legs feeling like they weighed 1,000 pounds each, but I finally made it and tried to go to sleep. The entire night, I had horrible nightmares about my family and friends being tortured and dismembered in horrible ways. These nightmares persisted for the next 12 hours until I finally woke up. Still feeling messed up, I saw deformed burned people walking around my bedroom and dead bodies laying in piles every time I would blink. I would see new people and a new room too. It was 3 a.m. at this point, or at least it looked to be. The numbers on my watch looked messed up, just like the text from earlier. I tried to go back to sleep again, but to no avail. This time, I saw the nightmarish images from the dreams with my eyes open. These had persisted for another 12 hours until I finally felt mostly normal. I still saw some flashbacks from the trip out of the corner of my eye for the next week and a half. I never heard from D again since his account was deleted when I went to search for it. This is Madness by Dead Ringer. I had tried Datura 3 or 4 times at low and moderate doses and found it to be heavier in side effects than psychedelic ones. But being bored one Sunday afternoon, I decided to take out the envelopes of seeds I had culled from the Datura plants I'd grown in my garden the previous summer and do a righteous dose. I'm an experienced user of psychedelics and believed I could handle it even with a new roommate in the house. So I pulverized a lot of the seeds with a hammer and put them into a pill box. I retreated to my bedroom and started sprinkling the ground up seed mix into water and drinking it. It's hard to tell exactly what my dose was, but after several glasses of water/Datura, the physical effects kicked in. They were very unpleasant, and I was immediately sorry that I had done it. I felt a nausea-like discomfort and the usual savage case of dry mouth. My limbs were difficult to move, and even limited movements felt sickening. About 4 hours after taking the dose, the trip started getting hallucinatory. I was drinking lots of water to offset the dehydration to no avail, and going to the bathroom often. But urinating was difficult and not very effective. The bathroom looked normal, but when I looked down into the toilet, the water was covered with a layer of gelatin with rainbow highlights. Occasionally, I saw small ticks on the wall, and upon closer look, they were spiders. By about 11 p.m., my roommate Jenny was asleep, and I was tripping hard but didn't necessarily realize it. Everything was very dreamlike, and during one of my journeys to the bathroom, I saw Jenny there, sitting on the toilet with the lid closed, looking at me. We stared at each other for a long time, and I looked down momentarily, and when I looked up at her, she wasn't there. Never had been. So began a series of hallucinations. In the house's second bathroom, I saw Jenny standing next to me, looking at me. I turned to her and resolved to muster a reassuring smile, but when I turned, I realized that what I had really been looking at was my own reflection in the mirror. I was very alarmed and thought, this is madness, but my reflection was wearing to the placid smile I'd put on for Jenny, and my calm expression was somewhat reassuring. From that point on, I was very messed up and was moving around, bumping into things, hallucinating, and tormented by mental confusion. I had minimal short-term memory, and at one point noticed that I had left the bathroom sink faucet running full tilt for an unknown length of time. Colors and sounds were amplified. There were times when there were lots of people in the room, having a party. When I tried to talk, they'd stop and listen, realize I was incomprehensible, and then ignore me and continue their conversations. At some point, I saw one of the tick-spider hybrid creatures come on the bathroom wall, and put my finger on it to confirm it wasn't really there. When I lifted my finger, I saw a nail hole underneath, and I pressed my finger on it, and I felt the paint and plaster cracking to confirm that it really was a nail hole. I laughed at mistaking a nail hole for a spider tick and left. The next day, I realized the wall was perfectly smooth, with no holes whatsoever. After a troubled night, I awoke thinking the trip was over and saw that things weren't quite right. My battery charger was unplugged and lying on the other side of my bedroom. A rented DVD was by the bed with a pair of scissors from a kitchen drawer, my toothbrush and toothpaste and my socks neatly arranged on it. I walked into the kitchen and the answering machine was unplugged. I had no memory of doing any of these things. I went to make coffee and the coffee pot had vanished. All of my toiletries were gone. Later, I found my razor in the washing machine. A $300 paycheck had been taken from my clipboard and was in the recycling bin. A tube of my roommate's toothpaste was in the kitchen cupboard, and so on. I thought the trip was over and was glad, but after rigging up some coffee, I noticed the paint was moving on the patio windowsill. This marked a second phase. The physical effects had lessened, and I was capable of talking. I started smoking marijuana and spent the entire day lying on the couch, smoking pot, drinking coffee, looking out my backyard garden, and listening to CDs on headphones. I was having lots of entertaining hallucinations. It was a sunny, windy day, and the plants were blowing around and they looked like witches, trolls, and hobbits. There was a community of strange and absurd characters in one of the rhododendron trees. The music sounded great. I looked at my hand and knew it had a shiny, waxy appearance, and layers of it dissolved like layers of paint or melting wax, and finally I was looking at the hand of a creature from another world, with a thumb and 2 fat, waxy fingers. All this was very enjoyable, and I was lucid, and even had a short conversation with Jenny, who was really there this time. Later I went for the walk to the park, and all the trees had faces and were smiling at me. The plants seemed to be bending to me, crying out for affection, each one saying, "Me, me," and demanding to be stroked and hugged. I did comply, but didn't go overboard with it. For days afterward, I felt foggy, and a day or so later it occurred to me that Jenny couldn't have possibly slept through all the noise I was making. I'd even stumbled and crashed loudly into the wall near the door of her room, and I thought that maybe I did something I hadn't remembered, and that maybe Jenny actually had been in the bathroom one of those times. All seemed normal, however, but about 2 days ago after the trip, I noticed Jenny was packing her stuff into her car trunk. She packed a bunch of stuff and then left without explaining and didn't come back that night. I was certain that I had done something during the trip, or that she encountered me in that very messed up condition and was frightened. I thought I was lucky she didn't call the police. The day after she left, I emailed her and told her how sorry I was, that I would be very cooperative with whatever she decided to do from here. She responded and basically said that everything was cool and she didn't know what I was talking about. She said she was only visiting a friend and didn't tell me because she was in a hurry and would be back the next day. So it goes with powerful psychedelics like Datura, which temporarily obliterates thinking processes and memory. Although the second 12 hours or so of my trip was very satisfying, the first half was extremely disorienting, dangerously so. I would also say that I will never try it again, but I wonder. Eating Bugs While My Friends Convulse by Mikey. My first and last Datura experience started with me and two friends sitting around at a house deciding to rip off a Datura plant. After finding one and tearing a few flowers off it, we sat at a mate's house and boiled it all up for half an hour and drank about 3 cups each. Now I am a very experienced drug user, but what happened next I was totally unprepared for. At first, the only feeling I felt was extreme muscle tiredness, and I was almost unable to stand. Neither could my friends. Bang! I'm at my friend's flat chatting to his flatmate. I say I want to go home now. He says, "You are home." I say I want to go home where my mom lives. She says, "I am your mom." Bang! I suddenly realize I am at home. It's almost midday. As my memory comes back, I remember smoking many invisible cigarettes, thinking my mom and brother were friends of mine, talking to invisible people, basically not knowing where, what, how, or why. I later found out I had been crawling on the floor where we originally drank the Datura, eating bugs, while my friend convulsed and foamed at the mouth. When his straight sister called the ambulance, I leapt off the balcony in pursuit of a friend who was actually on the other side of the house. Then my mom was called, by whom I still don't know, and she took me home where I spent hours rolling imaginary joints, snorting imaginary lines, talking to thin air about crap, and basically scaring the shit out of my family. One friend wound up in some bushes with no belt, pants around his knees, listening to music. The other was in the hospital in a morphine-induced coma. He was released the next day. He had been on antidepressants, and that fucked him up. I can tell you it's a very disturbing experience to take a drag on your cigarette and find out what you have done, or to talk to your brother about himself thinking he's someone else, or having your friends come around to see how you are, having a long chat with them only to realize they are not there. I cannot remember. It is all that it was only 3 days ago, and I can't operate properly. It's taken 2 hours so far to write this because I can't see. I do remember trying to smoke my belt, throwing my cat in the bathtub, thinking my mom was Spike Milligan. The list goes on. Suicide Plant by Kilogram. Everything started when me and my girlfriend were in a bar drinking and talking about drugs, and we decided on a drunk head that we should do a psychedelic on that night. So I called a good friend of mine that I knew that I always had something, and we went and took whatever he gave us. He just told us that this is a plant that produces hallucinations. So after a couple hours, me and my girlfriend took 1.5 teaspoons each, and in 30 minutes we were so heavy, so restless, so sleepy, and we took the cab and went home. We really wanted to go to sleep, no talking, no hallucinations so far. So we are in the bed, and every 5 minutes we were going to the toilet, but none of us could do anything, and back to bed where we could not sleep. Then it started. I remember that the first thing I saw was steel bugs coming out of the carpet in the restroom while I was trying to do something. Then I was in the bed and realized that my girlfriend was not in the bed. In the restroom was no light on, and I began seeing dark silhouettes coming from the wall with a lot of big and small bugs. Then all of a sudden I saw a bunch of guys that were looking at me, and in the house every single light was on. I remember that I was in a dark room where I could not see a thing, and I was trying to go somewhere, and I was just hurting myself because I was hitting invisible walls, and had the feeling that everybody else was looking at me. Where I went, I was hitting the walls with my head really hard. I got up in the morning still on Datura. I looked for my coat to go to the college, and my girlfriend was, and at the same time was not there. My coat was actually somewhere where I never thought it would be, in the garage. So I thought I was really late for the lessons, and I took a cab because my instinct told me that I could not drive in such condition. I was not seeing anything on my watch and could not read anything. I was trying to smoke, so I was smoking, and then I realized that I had no cigarette in my hand. I was just imitating smoking with my hand. I saw a lot of familiar faces as I was walking on the street saying hi. In reply, they were disappearing, and so on. The most terrifying part is that when I came home from my girlfriend had a black eye full of blood and you almost couldn't see the eye at all. I thought that this was a hallucination too, but was not. Actually, the bumping into the invisible walls at night might have been real. Flailing around without seeing anything, my girlfriend hurt her eye by falling face first into the corner of the TV. I'm surprised she didn't lose her eye. She's okay now, but for a month she couldn't see, and her eye was horrible. It turns out my friend did not know the real effects Datura, since he got it the same night we got it from him, so he never tried it. We told him what happened, and after what almost killed him because of what he gave us and because of my girlfriend. So everybody there that wants to try this plant, go for it, if you really don't care about your life. And if you decide to do it, then do it in a field that has no trees, no nothing that might hurt you, or take small doses that will just make you delirious. This is a devil's plant that I wish I had never tried. There are so many other psychedelics that are more interesting and safe.
Every day I think about this trip and wish I can go back in time to prevent it. It is the worst thing that's ever happened to me, and while I understand the innate curiosity associated with such a fascinating drug, I strongly urge you don't touch it, and if you decide to, take a much smaller dose, and don't do it alone. Seriously, try finding a single report with a positive experience. You can't. It all started in June of 1994, and my friends and I had just graduated high school. We were all massive potheads, but I had only ever used marijuana and tried mushrooms once. We also liked camping a lot, something I still do to this day. One thing we always made sure of was to camp as far from civilization as possible. I don't think camping at an established campsite is the real deal. You have running water, a fire pit, and sometimes even electricity. What's the point? You might as well just be at home. Luckily, where we lived in Oregon at the time, there was plenty of that. The weather was perfect, sunny, warm, and despite the mosquitoes, everyone was having a great time. We were on a hike, and about halfway into it, one of my close friends spotted a plant growing a few yards off the path. We'll call them Belvis. I'm not sure where they got the name, but we all called them that, and even some of our teachers. Yo guys, check this out. Belvis walked off the path and came back with a handful of spiky jimsonweed seed pods. I've heard of this stuff, it makes you trip balls. We should try some. I mentioned before that I had tried shrooms once, and it was actually on another camping trip like this one. The dose was relatively low, and all I remember was the sunlight streaming through the trees looking really pretty, so I was excited to try this new stuff since I thought it would be the same, but oh boy, it was not. We were all clueless and thought it would be a great idea, except for Belvis' sister A. She thought that if anything was to go wrong, she didn't want it to go wrong out in the middle of nowhere. I wish every day that I had listened to her. When we got back to the camp, everyone took 2 seed pods, except for A. We broke them open and ate the little black seeds however we could. My buddy E tried to eat them whole, but nearly vomited at the taste. I mixed them into a can of soup that I had brought and ate them, being careful not to chew them. A while later, I don't remember how long, but it could have been more than an hour, I really needed to piss and my mouth was dry as hell. I went behind a tree and tried to, but as with most Datura trips, nothing came out. It was at this moment a massive 100-foot tall tank passed over my head, crushing trees and leaving deep tread marks in the ground. This terrified me, not because of the massive fucking tank, but because I remembered that there was a military draft to Yugoslavia. In reality, there was none, but in my mind there was, and I was about to be whisked away from my scholarship at PSU, my future, and my family, and placed into war. I ran back to camp and found that my friends were all gone, replaced with demonic versions of them. They had skin that seemed to flash between jet black and bright white at an impossibly fast speed, and gaping holes for eyes. They all stared at me, and the next moment I was laying down in my tent. I don't remember walking to it or laying down. The travel happened in an instant. Then, the tent instantly transformed into my bedroom. It's strange how hallucinations manifest themselves. It's not like a sharp cut or a fade, but you simply look at something one moment, and the next moment it's simply another thing, with no change happening in between. Your brain just says, yeah, that's about right, and carries on. I got up from the bed and walked down the hall where my dad was sitting at the kitchen table reading a newspaper. He never reads the paper. I opened my mouth to speak, but he stood up and beat the ever-living shit out of me. My father isn't abusive and has never been violent to anyone, so I have no clue why I hallucinated this. I ran back to my room and found myself in Belvis's tent. He was there and without a word passed me a blunt. I smoked it for a while, but then I dropped it, and when I tried to pick it up, it was just a seam line in the sleeping bag I was sitting on. Belvis and I talked for a while until I found myself in the back of his truck. Belvis had taken his truck up there and he had taken their car. Belvis was in the back with me until he got snagged on a branch and yanked off at a high speed. For some reason, this was really funny, despite the fact that he was one of my best friends. I had no idea where I was going, and when I looked into the cab, there was nobody there. I was all alone in the back of his truck, speeding down the road. I got real scared and started banging on the cab's window, and in an act of desperation, I jumped out. The intense searing pain that followed was nothing I'd ever experienced before or since. I had road rash on both my legs and my left hand, but that pain was felt over every nerve and piece of skin in my whole body. I felt nothing but pain. There were no thoughts, only pain. I was in my own personal hell for what felt like an eternity. There was no time, no past, present, or future, only pain. The world around me looked like hell, full of deep reds and blacks, and a constant deafening scream was heard in my ears. The world around me looked like hell, full of deep reds and blacks, and a constant deafening scream was heard in my ears. Eventually, I must have fallen unconscious because the next thing I was aware of was being rushed into the hospital on a gurney. Once they noticed I was awake, they gave me a cup of something black and told me to drink it. I politely told the nurse no and handed it back to her, but when I talked to A afterward, she told me that I was screaming slurs and cursing and threw the black liquid all over her. Not sure what they did, but they probably gave me a lot of antipsychotics and put me to sleep. Later, when I had mostly come back to reality, my parents were at the foot of the bed, and the doctor told them I would be okay as long as I didn't ingest anything like that ever again. I had road rash and a broken leg and had to wear a crutch for a while, but I would recover. I hadn't completely come down from my trip while my parents drove me home, as I kept seeing people in the road who weren't there and warning my dad not to hit them, all with a mild background feeling of pain. I recovered, but it's a wonder I didn't die and that none of my other friends got hurt. While talking to A after the trip, she told me everything that she had seen. Everyone else had their own story, but what she saw me do was run into the camp with my dick out, screaming about Bosnia before jumping over the campfire and hiding in my tent. Then, about an hour later, I walked out of my tent and down the trail. I stood staring at a tree for probably a half an hour before screaming and running back to camp, this time hiding in Belvis's tent. Belvis wasn't in there. They were staring at the fire and mumbling to themselves. Everyone was going crazy, and several people had to try to jump into the fire or burn down the forest with burning sticks. A was getting really scared, so she corralled everyone into Belvis's truck and took us to the hospital, which I especially needed after falling out. There was no more room in the front for me, so I was put in the back. She saved my life, and I can't thank her enough. I have since then never done anything other than weed, and will never touch anything else. The eternity in hell of sitting on the pavement fucked with my brain. I don't know if it's PTSD or something else, but I frequently get flashbacks to that moment. If I can go back in time and stop myself from taking that damn plant, I would. The experience changed me, and not for the better. Don't take anything that can mess with your consciousness and make you do stupid shit beyond your control. It's a miracle none of us died, and if it wasn't for A saving us all, I might not even be alive. Don't take this stuff. Don't do it. No matter how curious you are, no matter how fascinating it is, don't do it. If you do decide to do it for some reason, only take a small dose and don't do it alone. Datura is scary stuff, man. So I've been upset about something lately, and I've been just getting super high to escape it, and lately it's been working for real. I feel pretty gone even when I'm not high, knowing I could just hit my dab pen and feel good again. I would smoke weed, but I can't at my house, and I can't sneak out and just smoke it either because I would need to smoke multiple times. I also apologize if these words are disorganized. I still feel mildly stupid from the dose. Not in a debilitating way though, just a good way I guess. But the weekend prior to Monday, I was out of money, my cart was almost out, and I was super pissed about something. At this point, I don't remember what, so clearly I got what I wanted. So I had remembered seeing a big white field on a drive home one day, and I had seen a field like that before back in the summer with all the flowers, so I walked on the highway all the way back to the spot. I knew exactly how to get there, and only took about 30 minutes, and when I did get there, I noticed all the flowers were cut. I don't know if they harvest them or something, but I would have tried one of them too. I walked over to a point of the fenced-in field where some of the pods were sticking out, and I picked about 5, and just walked and wandered off for about 2 hours, getting stoned, feeling super content with my next few days. Eventually, my phone was almost dead, and I was thirsty, so I walked back home. Yes, I remember now this was the night before the night I'm about to write about. I got home and just dove right in. I don't know how high I got this night, but I know for a fact I got high because I got the annoying dry mouth that everyone talks about. I know now I did because of the guy staring at me in my closet, which I for some reason rationalized as real, and a homeless kid my age who was just having a hard time with his parents or something and wanted somewhere to chill. So I figured he had climbed into my open window, and then I remembered him doing it, which I hadn't before. A few times I would ask him, "Are you real?" And I would glance at him, and he would appear to move nothing but his eye to stare at me for about 4 seconds. Then he would look away as to try to avoid all conversation, even though he knew I knew. I just gave up and didn't want to be a dick, I guess. I really don't know what the fuck made me think this was okay. I'm going through a hard time with loneliness, admittedly, and at one point, his girlfriend crawled through the window. She had short pink hair, pajama pants, and a hoodie, and they were pressing their heads up against each other. This made me angry. "I'm sorry, but you guys are gonna have to go," I said to them, but they both just glanced over with their eyes momentarily and glanced back at each other and said and did nothing. So I just gave up and didn't really know what to do because I didn't want to wake up the house and let them know people were there. Then I would be more fucked in case they caught me. But also, side note, right here, right now, I just noticed I still have minor Datura visuals, which is just everything I stare at is breathing. But after a few attempts, I gave up and laid in my bed to face them so I could look up every now and then to check on them so they didn't steal anything. I thought they knew I took Datura, and they were taking advantage of me being high so I couldn't react in case they were fake and my parents would find out, and at one point they started to smoke something. I can't tell if it was cigarettes or weed, but I told them, "You can't smoke that in here." Then I have memory of one more person being there, although I don't quite remember what features they had, which gender they were, or what role they played in the events happening, but they all seemed to be laughing and having a good time ignoring me. I don't remember much past this. This was a more chilled out night. I woke up the next morning, and well, of course, I took a bunch of Datura seeds. I also drank coffee and had some wax hits before I started my day. Of course I did. Am I in control of myself anymore? I really don't know anymore, man. But yep, it got me feeling about how I wanted to, not be delirious, but stuck stoned, and nothing really happened through the day other than probably me laying down playing guitar, arguing with my parents. But when night came, I do particularly remember ingesting more seeds than I usually do. I already had a few days of previous seeds in me, plus the seeds I had taken earlier that day. This was when I got slapped with delirium, or at least my first experience with it. Might I say, scarily fun. I'm not gonna go into it about the dry mouth and the gravity pulling you down feeling, cause you guys already know all about that, but it is the first sign of the trip. Some kid, I don't know what he was associated with, but he seemed short, unconfident, and sad, and he took a hit from a blunt in some weird dissociative roto in my head. And when he got the blunt, he hit it, and he began to seize up and fell on the ground by my bed, and I didn't know what to do. I realized this kid was having a seizure and needed help, so I ran out into my living room to try to do something to help him, which I had no clue about. This is about when the confusion began. I didn't realize this was the trip anymore. These were real events happening that got in the way of me enjoying my trip. What I didn't realize though was something along the lines of me taking my phone out of my case, me getting confused and dropping everything in my hands, then looking on the ground and seeing nothing but my phone screen chilling there. Not even how the actual screen is, like just straight up a piece of rectangular glass with my phone on it. So I had to put it in my case to use it, which was very wonky and confusing, but I could just barely make out what I was doing on my phone. I was texting people, lots of people had texted me too, and then I remember dropping the handheld phone case contraption on my bed. I tried to pick up my screen, but it was just a ghost. I figured I needed to really push my fingers under it to get it, but I just couldn't. Then the screensaver function or whatever, the one that shuts your screen off, turned the screen off, and it disappeared into nothing. This freaked me out, and for some reason I had the idea I could make a new phone by cutting construction paper and piling it up underneath a cutout piece of plastic bag, all to fit into my phone case, which I tried to tape. All of this which I was trying to do was poorly coordinated, so I ended up cutting these shapes so many times. I don't remember exactly how much, but I know for sure I was making lots of noise, but I didn't care. I needed my phone. The contraption worked, although it was very flimsy and I had a hard time typing my passcode as the screen was crumbled up and crinkled with the plastic bag shape, so it was hard to type on. I don't remember what I was doing on my phone though. At this point, I also noticed the couple was back and watching my confusion. I also began talking to a friend who wasn't there, and in that moment, it was very hard to tell whether my speech was in my head or coming out of my mouth. I felt very stuck and like my speech was going to another plane. I could not tell where I was hearing it. I had been drinking from a jug of water all night, which really doesn't relieve anything, but I figured I'd do it to be safe, and I went out. This is about where my events lose track, and I have no idea what order these occurred, but I'll give brief moments I seem to be intrigued enough to remember them. I remember walking out of my room with clothes, I don't know why, and I started to put clothes into the dishwasher. I don't know if this was a hallucination, but I have a weird memory of finding a bottle with 20 milligrams of DXM, and I took that, and I also remember finding a piece of plastic paper with a tab in it, which I licked off the paper and took it. I have no idea whether this was real or not. My room was a mess, and I didn't remember why. I was looking for things like an insane man all night. At some points, I didn't know what I was looking for. I was just looking for something. I remember seeing these tiny clear geometric rainbow spiders, which generated sparkles that floated weightlessly around my guitar's fretboard while I played like jellyfish, and they crawled like spiders when they managed to touch down on the fretboard, but they couldn't for long. They would float back up in the air. This made me smile and feel really warm inside. Their legs looked like wobbly electricity that glowed a little bit. I was having audio hallucinations of repetitive sounds and some kind of distant radio station. I couldn't make out what they were saying, along with my mom yelling every now and then. I knew this was fake though for some reason. In the morning, I don't know if I had slept or not yet, but I was still hallucinating hard. While it was still dark, I remember going downstairs into my basement by myself and finding my grandmother alone, dead, just sitting there, cold and lifeless. It looked like she had been extremely sad and alone before she died. Why this didn't freak me out? I have no idea. I didn't know what to do, but for some reason I wasn't having an appropriate reaction. I just felt oblivious. At some point, I ended up approaching her again, and when I poked her, it turned out to be an arrangement of clothing and cloth for her white hair, which again I reacted to like a stone wall, like an observer. And this hallucination would keep repeating itself with my animals all night. They would be sitting, wagging their tail, and I would walk up close to them, but the closer I got to them, the more they stopped moving until I would get to them and they would be dead, wrinkly, and cold to the touch, and this would make me really sad, but then it would turn out just to be clothes. At some point when I woke up from whenever the fuck I went to sleep, I took more seeds and smoked and felt content with how high I was, unaware I was still tripping, and thought it would be okay to interact with my mom. Damn, what a bad idea. According to her, my words were severely disorganized. I kept talking about an elephant in the room and getting ready for school when she kept asking me what I was on, because my pupils were still huge and I was making no sense, and neither did my actions. I had no idea what was going on, although I thought I did in the moment. I kept seeing my dad walk into my room without talking to me and collapsing on my bed similar to how a bored teenager would, and I would ask him if he was okay, and he would shrug his shoulders. This happened 3 times, until one time my mom was talking to me asking me if I was on something, to which I kept saying no and then branching off into completely unrelated things. After my mom told me she was taking me to the hospital, I don't know what made me think I was coming down, but I thought I was. I guess because I didn't know the whole phone thing was a delusion yet, but I searched my cabinets and found to my surprise 10 25mg Benadryl tablets and took the whole bottle. My mom found 3 bags of Datura seeds and these weird Benadryl pills. Well, not Benadryl, they just had DPH in them. She asked what they were. I told her Benadryl. She didn't believe me, so she took them, the bags, and me to the hospital. I don't know if I was hallucinating, but the people in front of me were just smoking a blunt in the hospital waiting room, and this was funny to me. I asked my mom to go to the bathroom, and so I did. Feeling like a champ, I took a DPH pill I had in my pocket for some reason without any water, and smacked my card a bunch, then went out into the waiting room again. Not much to talk about in the hospital, just normal hospital shit. I was hooked up, all that shit. None of this turned the trip bad at all, mind you. The whole thing was a blast. In fact, I had to make sure my mom or the doctors didn't know how much fun I was having. My last hallucinations were me using a water bottle on the bed as my phone. My mom kept trying to tell me my phone wasn't there, but I wouldn't stop trying to text. I thought I was actually texting people. I thought I was doing something magic. What ended the trip officially was getting home and finding out my phone had never fallen out of the case. It never broke, and every text or anything I said to anyone was completely hallucinated. I got back home that night and did more seeds. This time just got high. I'm off my binge now, but can say I still feel pleasant and like it's easy to zone off. Everything appears to be breathing right now as I look around like on the come up, except I don't have the dry mouth, which is nice. Overall, Datura is a very confusing high. You won't notice most of your delusions are actually delusions. Be careful with it. But as for my opinion, I love it. Damn, I love it. I love the audio hallucinations. I love the adrenaline. I love the gravity pulling you down when you walk. I love the rainbow spiders, and that extreme headspace was completely free. Would I do it again? Absolutely. If you're going to try it, stay very hydrated, piss as much as you can, have some kind of reality check just in case, and you'll have a blast. THC helps too. Nowhere near as scary as people make it out to be. Trust me.
I had the craziest experience of my life, and to this day, I cannot figure it out. My friends refuse to talk about it. Until recently, I thought the whole trip lasted about 12 hours, from 5 p.m. when I drank the tea to about 5 in the morning. But after finally getting my friends to talk a little, I was out of it for more than 3 days. It's amazing I wasn't in the hospital. The only way I know I wasn't in the hospital or police custody was because obviously if that had happened, there would have been consequences when I came to. How did this all start? I was reading about Datura more than a year before the actual trip because I was obsessed with the idea of hallucinating, but couldn't get anyone to sell me mushrooms. And while on a walk with my dog, I realized that at the back of someone's driveway, right on a main road, I was actually seeing a Datura stramonium plant. I kept it in the back of my mind and went back the next year in August to find the plant flowering with spiky seed pods almost ripe. I was wearing cargo pants and had brought scissors, so I just carefully trimmed off 5 or 6 2 to 3 foot branches, stuck the branches in my pockets and took it all home and clipped it into bits that I left to dry on top of a fluorescent light. The material included a lot of beautiful flowers, about 15 seed pods, and probably 2 pounds of stems. It took about 3 weeks for the plant material to actually dry all the way through, especially the woody stems. Then one Friday night after school, I think it was the week before homecoming, I had a friend over, a guy I liked, and other people kept stopping by. I'd planned in advance to make a little tea to try that night, and the friend was just there by coincidence. I remember standing over the stove carefully stirring the liquid, chopping the plant material with a stainless steel spoon, and giggling maniacally every time someone came in and asked what the heck I was doing. I added about a half a pound of material and an even amount of leaves, stems, and dried flowers to 1 quart of liquid. When I stained it, the plant material looked like a washed out spinach, and the tea was dark golden brown with a very fruity but bitter smell. I put the used plant material in a bowl in the fridge for later and continued to boil down the liquid. That took about 2 hours. All the while, I kept getting chills of anticipation and having a great time talking to my friend. Finally, the tea was done. I poured most of it into a thick plastic water bottle, which I stowed in the back of the fridge, but poured half a coffee cup worth for myself. I was really scared, terrified, but I mastered my fear, and I remember saying, "Cheers, I'm in your hands now, universe." Looking back, I shouldn't have drank that much, but I did. And the last thing I really remember is drinking the bitter grassy tea, then my friend who I'll call M, asking if I wanted to go for a ride with him, getting in the car, and then riding around. Next thing I knew, I was in a strange car in the back seat, in the dark, parked in front of someone's house. I thought I was alone at first. Then it dawned on me that we were dropping M off at his house. Though who we were, I don't know. Then I freaked out because I didn't want him to go and try to follow him out of the car onto the lawn, but he disappeared. Then my friend, who I thought was M, but looking back seemed like a stranger, told me, "Come on, we're walking now, we've got to walk," as though he just magically appeared again. And then I felt deja vu and I asked, "Where are we going?" And I didn't get an answer and kept on a whole conversation with this person. Everything was so vividly real and seemed normal, but also not. Like the boogeyman could jump out at any minute and I'd shake his hand. I remember being cold and hesitant. My body was jerky as though my whole being was stuttering, and the streetlight seemed bright, and we were walking into the dark, and that scared me. My body didn't seem to want to follow my commands. I walked in the dark with this person on my right for what seemed like a really long time, but I don't remember going anywhere. Just cool darkness and blurs of light. The next thing I remember is walking up to a house where this one guy lived with my friend B and her friend Gina, and it was night still. I thought the same one. We knocked on the door, and apparently this guy was waiting for his parents to get home, or someone was sleeping, so we had to be really quiet, and I remember tiptoeing in and it was the funniest thing on the planet. Then things started to get weird. I think I was coming down, but I was really freaked out and I was sitting talking to them, but it must have been gibberish and I felt really self-conscious, but things seemed okay. I had a big shock. I remember a dark shape passing in front of me across the house, and for some reason all the lights were out. I got scared and started to stand, but a random hand goes over my mouth because I was about to call out, and a loud shh came out of her mouth. And she pushed me down to sit on the floor, and she was just forcing her hand over my mouth and holding me down. I felt there was a good reason for her doing that, so I gave in and did as she directed. Then she released me, and that seemed really funny. Then we moved into a bedroom with the biggest bed and a TV playing and a fish tank. I laid on the bed and watched the fish tank, and the next thing I know, I realize I'm trying to convince everyone in the room, 4 people, to save the rats that are drowning in the fish tank, and I shut my mouth because I realized that there were no rats. I remember asking what time it was, and apparently I'd asked that many times, and my friends got angry with me, so I started crying and I said I was sorry. Next thing I know, I lost a cigarette, and I don't even smoke. I remember asking them to help me find it because I was panicked it would burn the place down. My friends then passed me a bowl of weed, and my friend B held the pipe and my head because apparently I'd already burned myself twice on the pipe, so she just told me to inhale. I kept going in and out of some strange state. Finally, it was time to go. I think we'd been at that house till about 5 in the morning, and I got into a car. Whose? I'm not sure. After climbing out the guy's bedroom window with my friends and getting home, I was really tired. I went to bed with the worst dry throat after peeing what seemed like a flood and finally felt a little better. I saw my room, my whole room, and I kept getting startled awake, realizing I was looking around and seeing things with my eyes closed. I'd open them and not be able to focus on anything. My room is lit with a backlight. It's my nightlight, so everything was purple, but just dim enough not to hurt my eyes, and my sight with my eyes closed was crystal clear, but I couldn't see anything with my eyes open. It was all dark and blurry. I slept most of the day, which for a weekend wasn't unusual. And then I woke up to my mom coming home at about 9 p.m., what the clock said. It was hard to read, but I made it out, and she asked me if I'd done my homework. She worked most of the weekend and was gone a lot. I have no idea if I was home or not, but apparently it was already Monday and the 3-day weekend was over, so I had to be at school in the morning. That was the first real thing that happened, I think. I reeked. There was dirt under my fingernails. I was greasy and needed a shower. My head hurt from my eyes still being so dilated, and I felt very twitchy. My favorite jacket that I'd worn had a pocket torn off. Somehow, I smelled like beer, and my shoes were really muddy. The only thing that I actually found out was that the guy whose house me, my friend B, and her friend Gina were at actually happened, and he came up to me and asked, "Are you okay now?" To which I answered, "Yes," and he said, "Good, don't ever do that again. I was about ready to kick you out of my house." He just walked away when I asked what happened. So that scared me. I was ashamed I was a burden to my friend. Looking back years later, I don't know what I was thinking, but I believed all that happened in one day for months, and then finally started to figure out some bits and pieces. I don't know what happened, probably don't want to. Everything was so real. It was like I was taken to a whole different world where everything could happen. All my feelings were fleeting and transient, so at least my fear was intense, but not overwhelming. An interesting note. Apparently I was home at some point, and I made myself a Datura omelet with the leftover plant I'd boiled to make tea, which I puked all over my bedroom floor, but my friend B cleaned it up. She hinted about that for years and finally told me. Something that really scared me was a girl I'll call T who hinted I'd stop by school during the weekend while she was having band practice in the gym, but if that were true, nah. There have also been hints that I started a fire somewhere, but I don't have any memory. Though I did have burns on my hands. I think it was from a weed pipe though. I may do this again if I can find another Datura plant and some sober people to keep me inside my house safe and sound for as long as it takes. The Datura plant I used before was gone within a few months. I think the people who owned the property caught on to what it was, or they were just tired of it blocking the front of their car.
Somewhere between 11 and 11:30 p.m. on a mid-April day in a small Midwest town, two guys named Terry, me, and Will, my friend, were sitting around playing video games and had no marijuana. That's when I pulled out about 7 grams of months-old Datura noxia seeds, which were only known to me as moon lily variety at the time. These were from home plants of a relative to be passed to another until I had put them away and forgot about them. I don't remember how I came to learn that the moon lily was intoxicating because I didn't know its proper name for months after the experience. I assumed they were a variety of morning glory seeds, only learning the truth after following up on experiences in the archives. Nothing at all happened after an initial test of a gram at most, so I figured it would be safe for me and Will to try 3.5 this night. So here Will and I are thinking, what have we got to lose? After all, LSD and mushrooms wears off within 8 to 12 hours. How bad can an organic flower be? We both ate 3.5 grams of sunflower-tasting Datura seeds, each on an empty stomach. Pretty goddamn bad. Within 45 minutes and still expecting nothing, our vision began to fail like so many reports before this one. I thought that would be the worst of it, but not quite. Will decided he should go home a little after 12 to avoid coming home to angry, worried parents. As he walked out the door, I looked into his eyes and knew that we were in for something big. I should have stopped him then, but we've both taken hallucinogens enough that I felt like he could take care of himself. As soon as he left, I was on my computer and noticed I couldn't read it, much less stay concentrated on it. Again, like so many before, I found myself searching for dropped cigarettes, but they were burning through and sliding under the sheets. I could feel the burnt holes and heat coming off of them, feel the cigarette roll away from me under the sheets. And then it hit me that I never lit a cigarette, but I sure needed one.
Forget that I was just thrashing around like a wild man for imaginary cigarettes. It was time for the real thing. I actually smoked the same amount as I normally do, 30 to 45 minutes apart, but I always felt like I had one in my hand. Many times my index, middle fingers, and thumb would meet as I spaced off, and that would induce a frantic cigarette hunt. It was mostly happening in my left hand, which I don't even smoke with. This is the aspect I am most curious about of all my experiences. It's so common, the explanation is probably very simple. At some time I laid down to sleep it off. Big no-no. I'm guessing it was around 2 a.m. by this time. I never felt like I fell asleep. In fact, I sat right up and started using my computer at one point. I opened notepad.exe maybe by accident, not really sure. What I was sure of though was that aliens were typing messages to me and replying in real time. The room looked disconnected and distorted with subtle colors like red, green, and yellow, and everything seemed liquid, like as if I was in an out-of-body state, or at least how they make it appear on the soap opera flashbacks. I was visited by some friends, though I can only remember one person in particular, my girlfriend. I saw her sitting behind my oscillating fan staring at me, saying nothing. I started yelling at the top of my lungs, "Why won't you talk to me? Just fucking talk to me!" when I heard a knock at the door. It's my sister asking if I'm okay because they heard me talking in my room, and I say I was just having a bad dream, which wasn't a complete lie. All it takes though is one look into my solar eclipse of a pupil and the story falls apart. She tells me it's 4 a.m., which I have a hard time believing because in my mind, my friend had just left and I was listening to music and surfing the net, waiting for the seats to kick in that never would. Never mind talking with aliens or hunting for dropped cigarettes. Never mind becoming blind as a bat or hardly being able to swallow whatever liquids I drank to alleviate the dehydration. I didn't have the constant urge to urinate, possibly because I'd been trained from so many late night trips to avoid leaving my parents' basement at all costs. But I did take one bathroom break, which I took time out from to examine my pupils. That was just the reminder I needed to realize that I was fucked up and needed to avoid all contact. After my sister's concerned check-in in the bathroom break, there was another knock at the door. This time I told myself I was just paranoid and it was my imagination. After 3 or 4 knocks, there was no denying I was in deep shit. I answered it to see my mother's face, grim and threatening, with the question taking no time to jump from her lips. "Are you on something?" A million excuses filled my mind and I can't be sure, but the one that I believe popped out involved taking a few too many antidepressants. Not a bad choice as the label says it may cause hallucinations, delirium, dry mouth, and all the other symptoms I had. And she would know that working in a pharmacy, so I would be off the hook, able to go back to smoking my cigarettes in Insanity Land. Not quite yet. She wants me to go upstairs and talk, make sure I'm okay. Bad choice as I'm the farthest thing from okay. I found myself at the kitchen table near 5 a.m. jumping from the most nonsensical topic to the next. A wonderful show for your family? I think not. I would stop mid-sentence and come back into consciousness and think how much of an idiot I was for allowing myself to run off the handle like that, and the look on their faces in that moment of clarity was enough to shock me back into rambling and incoherent gibberish mode. This cycle went on for 20 minutes as I tried to be normal and thought I was playing them like puppets. That is, until I puked up a belly full of tea and half-digested Datura seeds all over the kitchen table. I was filled with dread that my lie would be discovered then and there, but it wasn't time for that just yet. Somehow I managed to lay myself on the kitchen floor where I watched armies of half cricket, half roaches in awe as they marched in perfect strategic lines like you see in the Chinese military marches. I was also threatened with the possibility of visiting the emergency room, which between bug-gazing moments I peacefully protested. After the nightmarish scene upstairs, I was somehow allowed to retreat to my room, unsure and only half thinking of what trouble lay ahead. I just wanted to be in the safety of my room. Once in, I immediately calmed down to my average state of being, although still experiencing the loose cigarette phenomenon as well as periods of spacing out and dreaming while wide awake. There were no more panicky hallucinations though. My girlfriend showed up and told me something bad has happened and she wants to know what happened. I ask her what the problem is, and apparently, Will's mom was calling up friends to see what poison had been given to her son.
I then start a short one-way conversation about my grandparents who she barely knows for no reason, until I snap back to reality and see the familiar shocked stare. That was when I realized how much trouble Will could be in. Through a friend, I learned that Will came home and began talking to imaginary friends. He was as blurred and blind as I was, if not more. It wasn't the incoherent gibberish or the psychotic look in his eyes that worried his family. It was the fact that he had been found eating carnation baby formula, and when asked what the hell he was doing, he replied, "I'm eating McDonald's." Both of our vision was restored after a day of sleep and recovery, which surprised me reading all the reports here lasting 4 days or longer. I had to admit to my mother what I had really done, and it was humiliating, just like the time when I told her I had tried coke, speed, and basically everything else but H. This time it was maybe even worse, because I undeniably lost control, and it was all over a natural legal plant. I have not eaten Datura again and don't plan on it anytime soon. I did begin experimenting with smoking the fresh picked leaves, flower, anther, and filament, and the results are much lighter. After less than a gram of flower material, lethargy sets in, known around here as Datura stoned. Also, I have a bit of anxiety fearing another onslaught by this untamed plant. I have yet to experience drastic effects smoking Datura that I had while eating the seeds. Knowing what I know now about the plant, I regret ever taking it as I did. Very foolish, especially considering the drugs in it. Then I think of the experience and feel a strong desire to go through it again because it is like no other drug. Yes, it is one unique ride, if for anything to have a better appreciation for the capacity of the mind and the potential to unlock some heavy subconscious ego-crushing insight. But the bottom line is to not do this alone, because reality becomes 100% subjective to a part of oneself that one may not know or even want to know. This is the closest thing to schizophrenia I could ever imagine, knowing enough to hide the fact that I had taken psychotic drugs while completely forgetting that I was on them. Scary indeed. I do not feel I was in serious danger or becoming sick from the seeds. However, it was obviously an unsafe state of mind. One last word of caution. It has been over a year since I ate the seeds, but over time I have caught myself dreaming while still awake in bed, believing it is all just a dream. Like many others into lucid dreams, I always test the boundaries of unreality by doing things I couldn't get away with in the real world, like tearing my girlfriend's panties off with my teeth, for example. Not a personal example in my case, but a very possible and potentially bad scenario if I'm not expected to act that way and if I'm not woken up in time. I have had these occurrences 3 to 4 times and never did before taking Datura, not even sleepwalking. I will be thinking it is okay to do this or that because I can just wake up or press reset like a video game when that's actually not true. That same feeling of stupidity I had between moments in and out of consciousness while on Datura is present after these rare experiences.